Okay, so I'll just have a few little pieces of information before we get started. As Catherine was saying, this is not a private conversation, but clearly is being recorded and will ultimately be made available to the public. We want this to be as fun of an experience as possible,
Okay.
so if at any point it becomes less than fun, just let me know and we'll take a break. We'll go to a different line of questioning, different topics. If at any point you need to take a break, just let me know. We can
Okay.
take as many breaks as necessary. My role in the interview is to speak as little as possible and to give you the space to tell your story, but rest assured that I am completely tuned in and listening and not checked out. So today is Thursday, October 24th, 2019. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm interviewing Marjorie Jordan here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And before we begin, if I can just get your verbal consent to be recorded.
Yes, you have my consent.
Excellent. So as Catherine might have explained in the email correspondence, this is a life history. We'll want to capture everything, not just your years working on the bird. So we'll start at the very beginning. If you can tell me a bit about when and where you were born.
Okay, I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. I left when I was 9 months old, so I don't remember anything about Boston. But my daughter actually, she was a professional ballerina out of high school. But during high school, she went to Boston twice to dance with Dance Boston in the summer. And so I got to I drove her there and I got to visit the city. And I've always had a special place in my heart for Boston just because I was born there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was the date you were born?
I was born March 19th, 1948.
Okay. And can you talk about your family's background, where they came from, how they ended up in Boston, your grandparents and parents?
Okay, I know very little. My mother left my real father when I was 9 months old, and we moved to Venezuela, where my grandfather was. My mother's mother died when she was 9 years old, but her mother knew she was dying for a long time. My grandfather worked in the oil business, first in Mexico until they nationalized the oil, and then in Venezuela. So when my mother left my real father, I was 9 months old, my older brother was 2 years old, and she took us to Venezuela to live with her father. And there she met my stepfather, whom I thought was my real father until I was 16 years old. And so he was a soil mechanics engineer, and he worked, so he would do the base of major construction projects, and then we would move to another country where he would do the base of another project. So we moved from country to country. So my mother's father, Jim Evans, and my mother's mother, and I don't know her name, that's incredible, but I don't. But my mother and my mother's mother and my mother's older brother lived in New Orleans while my grandfather was in the oil fields in Mexico, because the oil fields were too rough to have his wife and child. So what she would do is the oil tankers because he managed a refinery in Mexico. The oil tankers would bring the refined oil to Brownsville, Texas, and then the empty tankers would go back. So to see her husband, she would go down to Brownsville and take a tanker back and then back to Brownsville. That was the way she visited him. During one of those trips, she contracted malaria. And the only way to cure malaria at that time was massive doses of quinine. Well, she found out she was pregnant with my mother, and she had a choice to make. Either she took massive doses of quinine and aborted the baby, or she didn't take the quinine. Therefore, she had malaria, but she saved the baby. So she decided not to take the quinine. And so my mother was actually born in a hospital in Chicago that had had the best luck in keeping both the mother and child alive when the mother had malaria. but her mother was so sick that she wasn't able to hold my mother until she was released from the hospital. And then I think they gave my mother's mother 2 years to live because malaria causes high blood pressure and constriction of the veins and arteries, especially the ones going to the brain. So people generally, within a couple of years died from a stroke. But my mother's mother actually lived 9 years. And unfortunately, I think she knew that she was going to die, and so she wanted my mother to be strong and not to be attached to her. So she kind of pushed my mother away, or wanted her to be strong rather than nurturing her. So that was an issue with my mom all her life. My grandfather never remarried, because he felt so guilty about, my mother's mother dying because of the trips to Mexico. My real father, I know, my grandfather was, from his father's side, he was Welsh. And actually his father was a minister that ministered to the Welsh miners in Pennsylvania. My grandfather was born in Pennsylvania. And he had a Welsh father and a German mother. She actually went to the university. His wife actually went to the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So she was very well educated for a woman at that age, that era. She died when my grandfather was 8 years old. So it turned out that my mother was raised by a motherless father and without a mother. My real father, I found out when I found out I had another father, a real father, was named Frank Wysong Jordan, and he was 100% Welsh. And I don't know anything about him, although I know his parents ran a drugstore in Bedford, Pennsylvania, which is where my grandfather is from, and my older brother was born in Bedford, Pennsylvania. So my sister had done some searching and found out, actually she found the, I guess my grandfather on my father's side, when he passed away, the article in the paper about him said he had 2 grandchildren, and I was one of them, and my older brother was one. But we never associated with that family after my mother moved to Venezuela. So that's my stepfather, Woody Woodsmall, came from Oklahoma, and he had a very difficult childhood. He never spoke about his mother or his father. He was very distant from us kids, so we don't know anything about him. I mean, I never ever had a conversation with him, and my mother divorced him when I was 19. So, I mean, I just had no relationship with him whatsoever. So I don't know anything. I know he had a sister, but he never talked about her, never talked about his parents. We never saw them, never visited them. He was very alienated from his family. And he was a big drinker and gambler, and that's what finally did him in. Also, my real father, my mom left him because he was a violent alcoholic. And my older brother found that he had a second family about 10 years ago, and he has been in touch with that family. Those 2 kids, so that my real father had a second family with a boy and a girl. And my older brother, who was searching for my father, his whole adult life, found out that this family existed, and we know from that family that my father died of cirrhosis of the liver. We knew he died very young because I was 19 when I got a letter from the VA. My older brother and I got a letter from the VA saying he passed away. But we could never get any information from the VA. But now we know more. In fact, I actually have a photograph of my father, which, I didn't know existed. Mm. So I found out that I had another father when I was 16 years old. I was swimming for the swim team in Sarasota, Florida, and evidently people had been swimming for other people, and the school wanted that to stop, so they actually ordered all of the birth certificates for everybody on the swim team. And I was called into the office, and they said, "Why do you call yourself Marjorie Woodsmall when your name's Marjorie Jordan?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And they gave me the birth certificate, gave me a copy of the birth certificate. I took it out to my mother, and my mother said, "Yes, I didn't tell you this, and Woody really wanted to adopt you, but he hasn't, so your name is Marjorie Jordan." So I immediately changed my name to Marjorie Jordan. Because I did not like Woody, you know. I had no relationship with him, and so anyway.
And did you then spill the beans to your brother?
Well, my brother evidently knew. I mean, we never talked about it, but he knew in a sort of subconscious way, because he was 2 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we both changed our names, you know, to he's Jim Jordan, I'm Marjorie Jordan. So.
And what was your mom's name?
My mother's name was Margaret Aurelia Evans. So my grandfather was Evans, and my daughter is named after her, Margaret Aurelia Evans. Although my mother went by Margie, and my daughter goes by Maggie. So anyway.
And so there's a whole lot there.
There's a lot there.
But let's start when you're 9 months old,
Mm-hmm.
you moved to Venezuela.
Right.
And where do you move to? Is it a...
It's called Puerto La Cruz,
Mhm.
and his house was perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. So it was a really a beautiful home, and evidently not too far from there is where the oil refinery where he worked was.
Mhm.
Because my mother tells a story about when I was 2 years old. She suddenly sees this great big construction truck coming up to the house, and she notices this little tiny person sitting in the front seat or standing in the front seat, and the construction worker comes out and says, "We found her wandering on this road." So she said she tied bells to my shoes so that everybody would know where I was. Yeah. So, but I don't remember anything except the stories that Mom told about Venezuela.
Because how long were you there?
I was there, I was 4 years old. No, I was 3 years old when my mother married Woody. So what happened when I was 3 is we moved back to, my grandfather had retired in Sarasota, Florida. So we stopped in Sarasota, Florida. Evidently my mother married Woody, which my older brother and I weren't involved with. But one of my first memories is that I was sent to nursery school while we were in Sarasota. And they taught me Jesus Loves Me. My mother says, she took me to a 5 and 10, and I was singing like, "Jesus, Jesus." And she would say, "No dear, no dear." But that's one of the first memories I have is of being in a nursery school there. Mm-hmm. And then my stepfather moved to the Azores, where he was building an airport. And so he was doing, the bottom part. So we lived in the Azores for 1 year. And I have a few memories. I know that the streets were cobblestone, and the houses were these little cute whitewashed houses with red roofs, red tile roofs. And it was really pretty and quaint. And my daughter actually took a vacation there last year. And she said it's pretty much the same, although much more developed. And I guess they've made I guess there are direct flights from Atlanta to the Azores now, because it's called the Hawaii of Portugal. So we lived there for 1 year, and then we moved to Peru for 4 years. That's the longest we lived anywhere until we settled in Sarasota. My stepfather was dredging out the Callao Bay to allow larger ships to come in to the port there, which is, Callao is really close to Lima, Peru. Mm-hmm. So we lived in Lima for 4 years. And I have a lot of memories of Lima. So my first language was Spanish, although I always understood and could speak English because my parents spoke it to each other. But we children always spoke Spanish to one another. And
that's, other than nursery school, I guess your schooling began, and I'm assuming that you were not an English English language schools
No,
abroad? You
no.
were just in their school, the
Yeah,
school,
well, actually,
local schools?
one year, so after Peru, we moved to Turkey, where my stepfather was building a pipeline, which I believe was talked about during the Iraq War, the pipeline that he was building that goes through Turkey. And we went to, the only time we actually went to an American Army base for school. We did not go to a Turkish school, we went to the American school. Now, my younger brother and sister did not learn English, so anyway, we've got some more countries to go to. But after, so we lived in Turkey 1 year, and then we moved to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Right now, I know where all the immigrants are coming from. We actually lived in those countries. And my stepfather was building the Pan American Highway through those 3 countries. Excuse me. My stepfather, who we did not know until we came back to Sarasota, was bipolar. I knew, and I could tell he did things that grown-ups aren't supposed to do, you know. And he was also a big gambler and a big drinker. Well, there were issues with the Pan American Highway being built because, as you may know, a lot of Latin American countries have a lot of graft and corruption. So evidently they were not mixing the proper ingredients. And especially in Honduras, there's a rainy season and a dry season. And when it rains, it just rains all day long, just pours out from the skies, just massive amounts of water. And evidently the road was starting to break up. And he found that out because we went to Guatemala, Honduras, and then El Salvador. He found that out when we were in El Salvador. And he went into a manic state and actually borrowed a bunch of money from people to gamble with. And he went to Havana, which is where people went to gamble. And he lost it all. So he then flew off to New York, and my mother was left with 4 of us in El Salvador. And so she said to us, we're going to go to Grampy's house, and my grandfather had moved to Sarasota for Christmas. And she packed up everything she could that we could get on the plane, and we moved to Sarasota. 2 weeks she went back to the house in El Salvador to get the rest of everything, and also we had left our dog there. And she had to get special preparation and permission from the airline and everything to bring the dog on. And the house had been stripped. My father had a lot of expensive fishing equipment because both he and my mother were like world champion deep sea fishers. And he had a lot of other things of value, but the creditors just came in and wiped out everything. But she was able to bring our dog back to Sarasota.
And how old are you at this point?
I am 12. I'm going to be, 13 the next March. And so I remember her taking us to this little hamburger joint that was really right adjacent to the elementary school, Bay Haven Elementary, and saying, how would you like to stay here and not go back to El Salvador? I said, no, because I had friends and everything. And I didn't speak English, and everybody else was speaking English. I mean, I could, but not well. And my older brother said, no, we are not going back, we're staying. He really wanted to stay. So anyway, we stayed. And I was actually put in the 6th grade, even though I should have been in the 7th grade, because I only knew math and the metric system. And when we went in to test me about where I was, and English spelling is so difficult compared to Spanish spelling, which is all, what something sounds like is how it's spelled. So I actually finished the last part of the year, 6th grade, and then I went to 7th. But anyway, and that's being in Sarasota was the first time that we all had experienced discrimination, because I grew up in Latin culture mainly, and in Latin America, girls hold hands, they put their arms around each other, and boys do the same thing. So when I would do that in school, they'd go, are you queer? Are you? And I didn't even know what that word meant. And then they would say on the playground, you can't play this game because spics don't know how to play this or that. It was right after the Cuban Revolution, and there was just a lot of discrimination because of all the Cuban people that were coming in to Florida. And my younger brother and sister, they actually broke down and was just sobbing in school because they had Spanish names, Elisabetta y Guillermo, and so my mother and grandfather came and picked them up and said, your name's Billy and your name's Betsy. And, but they had such a hard time because they did not speak English. And they were 6 years old. Yeah.
And so I was going to follow up on that. So your mom and Woody.
No, my mom and my grandfather.
But your mom and Woody had two
right, my
children.
Mother, yeah, my mother thought.
So these are her half-siblings.
My half-siblings. But I never thought of them like that because I thought we were all,
Right.
So even today I don't think of them that way because it was so long before I understood that I had another father. And I took his name, but my relationship with my younger brother and sister is like we're all.
Yeah.
So we never talked about them being step sister or brother. But yeah, so my mother thought, well, Woody doesn't like my kids, but if I have his kids, he'll love them. Well, no, but he just didn't have the emotional capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, he was incapacitated really emotionally by his bipolar, which we didn't know. We knew he was a brilliant engineer, but we didn't know, except we could see him acting out in ways that weren't normal. But my mother here is with 4 kids, living in third world countries. There's no way she can divorce him. There's no way she can earn a living, to raise these kids. So.
Can you talk a bit more about growing up and sort of bouncing around in these different places and whether you had a sense of belonging or nationality? Like clearly your mom and grandfather are American. Does that register?
And so is my stepfather.
Yeah,
He's American too.
Does that register for you?
Well, it was very difficult, because we would move from country to country, not just a different city. So we had to leave all our friends, make new friends, go into a new school with new rules. So it was very difficult. And since Woody was not supportive of us or my mother really, it all fell on my mother to, because I just hear one day we're moving to Turkey. And my mother would start, figuring out what we could take, what we couldn't take, blah, blah, blah. So there was just a lot of disruption and a lot of loss. Now when I look back on it, I go, oh boy, I was so privileged to see these different countries and to see how human beings live, because I had such a different view when I came back to this country of how much poverty there is in the world and how much injustice. I had a very different worldview than the people I was going to school with. Because when you look at Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the indigenous people are just treated like dirt, even though they have these wonderful cultures that go back tens of thousands of years. But we always had people working for us in our home. We knew how poor they were, and that this was, they lived with us except one day a week when they got to go home. So we knew they must be, very hard off, because why would you want to live in somebody else's house, if you have a house of your own? So I was very keenly aware of the privilege that we had and the poverty all around us, or the difficulty. And also because my mother had to pay bribes to keep the electricity on, the gas on, the water running. I understood corruption at a very basic point. Because I knew if my mom didn't deliver this person that came and knocked on the door cash, we were going to have the electricity turned off or the water turned off. So I guess my worldview was so different from the people around me who didn't have any sense of what the enormous privilege we live in here. And also because I loved my maids, because they were the ones that were with me all the time. And I knew how oppressed they felt. I've been a real progressive person from the time I was a child, because I could see this. And So, but now when I look on it, I go, wow, I got to see Guatemala, I got to see these wonderful lakes and volcanoes, and I got to see Peru, which is just an absolutely beautiful, gorgeous country. Same with Guatemala, I'd say those two are the best. And then I got to live in a Muslim nation in Turkey and see how completely different the personalities of people are. Because even though that was supposedly a very progressive country at that time, still my mother had dog shit thrown at her because she wasn't wearing a veil, you know, and I could see, I mean, and the people that worked in our house were so unfriendly because they saw us as dirt, they saw us as non-believers. And also, you know, they had the call to prayer all over the city 5 times. So it's so different, you know, because obviously Latin America is a very Christian countries, but you weren't looked down on if you weren't a Catholic, or, you know, and it's also just very different culture. It's just very warm, outgoing, welcoming. There were constant festivals, and there was also just a deep spirituality that you could see. You know, there were lots of saint days that were celebrated, and the people that worked in our home would each have like a plaque of their saint, and they would be saying the rosary. I mean, and it wasn't out in your face, but it was just deep inside, and how people, you know, crossed themselves and believed that that was a blessing they were giving themselves, or whatever situation. So it was just very different cultures, and I got to see both of those. And we actually, in Turkey, we actually lived in a neighborhood that the British had built. And so they were, you know, really sturdy, big houses. And the neighbors across the street from us also had 4 kids, kind of close to our ages, so we just played with them all the time. The father was American, the mother was Turkish. So they were more upper middle class Turks. But when we'd go shopping and stuff like that, we saw a very different response. Because, you know, especially we were going out with our mother because my father was in the oil fields. And, you know, the prejudice against women, you know, the people that worked in our house always wore really long skirts and, you know, covered their heads. And so they just looked down on somebody like my mother.
And in Guatemala and El Salvador, Peru, the household help that you had, did they take you out? Did you go shopping with them? Did you ever get taken to their houses?
Actually, in Honduras, we went to our chauffeur's house. And he, you know, the chauffeurs were considered, it was actually a chauffeur for the business my father worked for, my stepfather worked for, called Thompson Cornwall. So he was actually the chauffeur for that engineering firm. But mainly he took us back and forth to school because, you know, in Latin America you go to school until lunchtime, then you come home for 2 hours, and then you go back to school. And you know, he was just so proud to show us his home. And we went downtown into one of these areas where the houses are really short, small. He had a dirt floor. He had corrugated metal for his roof. My mother and stepfather both had to duck, you know, inside the home. But he was just effusive. I mean, he was just so happy to have a house that he owned. So what I learned a lot is just how deprived even the supposed upper echelon of people that were around us, that worked for us, their situation was. I mean, how little they had. They lived in hovels with dirt floors, no running water, which is the way that the vast majority of human beings live on Earth. Mm-hmm. No telephone, no car. In fact, my mother had somebody come and stay, a woman come and stay with us in El Salvador while I think she was trying to see what was going on with Woody, talking to his people in his business that were coming to her and saying, something's really wrong with Woody, when he'd gone into this manic state. And she said, you know, Latins go to church all the time, and she was going to church every day. And I said, are we going to drive your car? She says, yes, we're going to drive my Dodge. And she walked to church saying, we're driving my Dodge. You know, I mean, none of these people, even the ones that were well paid, according to that system, they had nothing. Well, because we're all about what do you have materially. And they had nothing, but they were the kindest, sweetest, happiest, joyful human beings I've ever been around. They were just really happy to be alive. They laughed and sang, and it was just joyous. And that's how I think of Latin people. And that's why what Trump's doing right now, these are the hardest working, most spiritual, family-oriented human beings on earth. And we're putting them down like they're rapists, the enemy of people. It's just, categorically wrong. So that's my view. I just absolutely love Latin people.
And did you have much contact with your family here in the States, I guess mainly your grandfather, in these years that you're living abroad? Were you coming back for holidays or summer vacations?
No, we never traveled back to the States, but Grampy came and visited us in other places. So my mother was very close to her father. That was the only relative I ever knew. It turns out that my grandfather had a brother who had, I think, one child, but the only time I met Uncle Jack was at my grandfather's funeral, and I never met his wife and daughter. Did not come to the funeral. So as far as I was concerned, there was no other family. I had an Uncle Jimmy, my mother's older brother, but he passed away before we left for the Azores. So I was 3. So I knew him and his fiancée, Aunt Fanny. But otherwise, I had no family. And so when I met Steve, who has this illustrious family that goes way back, and then Steve Wise, yeah. And then 4 brothers and sisters, and hundreds, if not thousands. No, he has thousands of cousins. So my children have had a completely different, view of the world. For one thing, they've all lived in Atlanta from the time they were born, so they have the sense of place. And then they have this huge family. Yeah, so I didn't have that. Basically, it was my mother and my grandfather,
right.
And then my brothers and my sister that I considered my family.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're 12, you come back. Well, you come to the United States,
right,
to live with your grandfather.
Right.
Does Woody ever come back in the picture?
Yes. What happens is my mother goes after him. Of course, we all are just, thank God he's gone, but we don't understand the economics of all this. But my mother knew, for some reason, I don't know, he probably, he was just so unethical and immoral. He had a girlfriend in New York City. So my mother's best friend, and she's the other person, big person in our life, who was Ruthie Epstein, and I'll think of her father and mother, but she came from a very famous family, very wealthy family in New York. Turned out that my mother and Ruthie had roomed together during the war after college in New York City. Because after my mother's mother died, my grandfather asked to be able to work out of the headquarters in New York because he had 2 children and he didn't want to be living in Venezuela at that time. So they actually lived in Roselle, New Jersey. And my grandfather took the train back and forth to work at the Sinclair Oil headquarters. So my mother grew up around New York, and she just loved New York City. And when she got older, like a teenager stuff, she could go into the city. And she actually sang in Robert Shaw's chorale in New York City. And it was the only non-segregated chorale. And so she felt very comfortable around black people because she was raised by a black housekeeper after her mother died. And they also had one in New Jersey, first in New Orleans and then in New Jersey. So anyway, after she graduated from Wilson College, she moved to New York, and she and Ruthie became friends, and they roomed together. And for a long time, Ruthie didn't tell Mom how wealthy she was. But her father worked in the Roosevelt government and also started the Washington Post. I'm trying to think of his name. But anyway, and they were extremely wealthy, because she took me to her childhood home in upstate New York, where it was this huge estate with a huge house with a marble Olympic-sized swimming pool in the basement, and bowling alleys in the basement, and they had their own organic farm and cows, and all the food was fresh, and all this stuff. But I'll think of her parents' names. But anyway, so Mom had this help her whole life, because Ruthie would come and visit, and they'd talk on the phone wherever they were. But Ruthie especially helped us out in Sarasota. I mean, she helped my mother buy groceries and, buy clothes for us. And I think she set her up with accounts in various stores, because Woody was so unpredictable. So when we got to Sarasota, my mother found Woody in New York City. She was able to talk him back to coming to Sarasota, and she was able to get him to go for psychiatric examination with the only psychiatrist that was in Sarasota at the time. His name was Sam Warson. So long story, but she later married him. That was my second stepfather. But Woody was then diagnosed as manic depressive, and Sam administered, I think, weeks of electroshock therapy, which finally shocked him out of the hyper state into a more depressive state, or at least balanced him out. And he went to Tampa and found a job with Gahagan Dredging Company, which at that time Florida was being dredged, and so that they could, like Sarasota, Longboat Key, they dredged it so that houses could be built on these little strips of land that came out into the bay, so that everybody could have a house with a boat and a dock. But they were doing that all over Florida. So this was a really good position for him, and mainly he was in Tampa. Most weekends he didn't come home, but when he did, he would always go. There was a dog racing arena in Sarasota. He would go bet on the dogs, and then he would go to High Lie, which is a really fast ball game that you bet on too, or he would go play golf. So we never saw him, but then every once in a while the police would call and say, Mrs. Woodsmall, we found your car out on Siesta Key, and so he would go on a manic, and he would do whatever because Mother didn't really tell us this stuff. We would just know we don't have a car today or whatever. But Gahagan, who was the head of this dredging company, then hired Woody, and knew Woody was really brilliant. But he had been an alcoholic, and it had taken him decades to finally give up alcohol. But at some point, he just finally said, "No, Woody, this is it. You're fired."
And is that what happened with the last job in Latin America when he went to New York?
Right.
Like they.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could never go back because he owed people so much money. I mean, he probably would have been killed. But yeah, he lost that job, and then with it, all the reputation that he'd had from all those years of working, because he'd worked for this company through Central America, but also in the engineering field around the world, at least at that time, you would keep running into people that had worked on this project or that project. So he had a reputation. So this was a big, fall for him. And then when he, because he was put in the hospital, the last manic state he went into. And so that's when Gahagan let him go. And at that point, and I guess I was 18, I was a senior. He was in a mental hospital, and when Mom when they were going to dismiss him from the hospital, they called my mom in, and they said the only way we'll let Woody go as if you will take responsibility for him. And she said, no, no. And she remembers walking down the hall and having him holler, Marge, Marge, please, please, Marge. And she just had to walk away from it. But thank goodness for Ruthie, helping Mother out during this period. But then my mother invented a job for herself. She had worked for CBS when she was, during the war, when she was in New York City. And it was supposedly this group of people, she was the librarian for them, were developing color TV. But in reality, it had to do with deciphering German code and all of this secret work that was being done for World War II. So she had worked for CBS for a length of time, and there was a CBS station in Sarasota, and she would listen to it every morning because she was still a housewife. I mean, she didn't have any way to earn a living. Although she sold World Book encyclopedias for a while until she'd hit up everybody she knew.
And what had she studied in college?
She studied, she was a math and physics major. Yeah. So I guess that's how she got the job in New York City, working with this group, because she was keeping the library, and all of these documents were math and physics kind of documents. But she invented a women's program. I mean, she put it together because she was listening to the radio all day, and there was nothing about and for women. So she put one together, and she put, I think she put a month of 1 hour long program in terms of what she would be, because she read a lot of magazines and books and stuff about women. And CBS bought it, and they said, well, if you'll come in and write the morning news, we'll give you an hour after the news to do this women's program. As long as you can find advertisers and as long as you do well. And it did really well. So she'd get up at 5 in the morning, go down to, there was a little coffee house, 24-hour coffee house. It might have been a Waffle House that had a lot of newspapers. She'd buy the New York Times, a Christian Science Monitor, I guess the local newspaper, Sarasota Herald Tribune, and she would read them and put together the news. She'd drive in to the station, give the news to the announcers, and then she did her program. And she got all of these small businesses on St. Armand's Circle, which is a kind of uppity place in Sarasota, and it's on the way to where the station was, which was on City Island, sort of an island between Longboat Key and the other key that was that you took a bridge to get to Longboat, and it did really well. So she did that for several years, and then she was asked to be the I don't know if it's the marketing person for the school board, but it was something like that, because they needed to raise the millage rate, and that was her job, was to, get the word out and advertise it for people to vote for, more taxes. And she succeeded in that. And then shortly after that, I got married to my first husband, and he had grown up in Gainesville, Florida. And Sam at that time had been teaching at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
And this is your second stepfather?
Yeah, but they're not yet.
Okay.
They had known each other because Woody was, he was Woody's psychiatrist. But they didn't see each other very much. But my mother decided just to invite him to the wedding. And they got together then. So after I was actually in California at that time. But that's another story about how I met my first husband.
Because how old were you?
I was 19 at the time we got married.
Okay.
Yeah. So is that enough about my early childhood?
Let's explore a little bit about who you were as a young person, what your interests interests were? What got you excited? How did you like to spend your time?
So I always saw, because my mother was so, she had such a difficult life. I mean, she had four kids and this crazy husband who was unfaithful to her throughout her marriage. He had so much privilege. He was often in another location doing construction. And I felt like my job was taking care of my mother. And she always wanted me to take care of my younger brother and sister. So I actually felt like a parent to my younger brother and sister and to my mother. And because my mother was a heavy drinker, just like Woody and all their friends were at that time, I knew that once she had a lot to drink, she was going to get more unstable and she was going to get abusive. So my job was making sure that everything was as good as it could be so that my mother wouldn't get mad or upset. So that's what I saw my job as. Whereas my older brother was very rebellious because he was being ignored and, you know, mistreated by Woody. He was just angry all the time. Whereas if mother said, who can help me with this? I go, I can. You know, I mean, it was just like, that was kind of my job.
And were you living with Gramps?
No.
So you guys
my grandfather lived in Sarasota, but he would come and visit us. Like he visited us in Peru. He visited us in Honduras. And also he would send my older brother and I like little comic little comics from the newspaper and letters. You know, I mean, he kept in touch with us. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I loved to embroider. Like, you know, the maids did sewing and all this wonderful stuff. So I tried to learn how to sew, and I learned how to embroider, and which is what people did in Latin America. And then since I was really, you know, we were really kind of isolated. So my older brother and I would play games like Monopoly and Canasta, Gin Rummy, you know. So we were basically the four of us together. And I would, you know, play with my younger brother and sister. And
did they have radio programs and television programs?
No, we didn't have a television until we came to the United States. Mm-hmm. But there were radio programs. Mm-hmm. And I remember in Central America there was this British English class, you know, so and we would listen to it every Saturday morning, and we'd listen to music. And there was a lot of, you know, Latin music in our house. And I spent a lot of time with our maids, you know, either in the kitchen while they were preparing food, or like you said, if they went to the store or something, I would go with them. And then also I was very interested in school, whatever school I was in. I liked that. But I remember myself as a very happy child, and not particularly, I got worried and more worried and anxious as a child when we came back to this country. Because, you know, there was no help, you know, like we had always had help in our house. And so there were always people to socialize with. But my mother really had a very hard time once we came back to this country. You know, the fact of feeling helpless. You have 4 children and you have an absent husband, even though he was earning a living at that time. Still, it was a very unhappy situation.
And when you came back that Christmas, fleeing, mm-hmm. and you stayed with your grandfather, how long did you stay? We actually stayed a year. Okay. We stayed 2 Christmases. And my mother always said that Woody bought the house for us in Sarasota, but he didn't. My grandfather did. And my grandfather lived very, very frugally because he wanted to give, you know, as much as he could to my mother when he passed away. So my grandfather bought us a home not too far from where he was, but it was on Bayshore Road in Sarasota, which was actually the first kind of upper middle class neighborhood that was built in Sarasota. Then things kept moving in Sarasota south. But this was the north end of Sarasota, not too far from the airport. It was also really close to the Ringling Museum of Art and the Ringling home, which is like a massive piece of property. And so that was all part of Bayshore. It started out with the Ringling property and then went with lots of,
and close to the Ringling Museum, there were lots of really big houses, and we were sort of in the middle range. But it was a really nice house for us, and we each had our own room, and it calmed things down a lot to have that. And then, you know, we would take the school bus to school. At that point, I was going to either junior high or high, and we could take the school bus to get there. And Elizabeth and Will, or Billy and Betsy, were going to Bay Haven Elementary. And by the time I left, they were 15. So I don't know what. Actually, they were 14. They were 14. So I don't know if that's junior high or high, but yeah.
And are they twins?
They're twins.
Yeah.
They're twins.
And so, if I'm doing the arithmetic correctly, you moved back to the United States in like 1960, 61?
Yeah. It was right after the Cuban Revolution. I can't remember what year that was. Was that 59? 59? Yeah. And also, that's the first time we had a television, and that's when these huge civil rights riots were happening, and people were being hosed down. And it's so different from Latin America, because in Latin America, there are all these shades of color, and it does matter, you know, because the upper class is all very light, because they consider themselves Europeans. They don't really consider themselves Latin. And what happened in Latin America is that the families that had done great favors for the king and queen were given plots of land. And in a lot of countries, that's the only land that is owned, that, you know, actually has parameters, you know, where it's put in the records. In other words, the whole country was cut up and given to wealthy families. Those are still the families that run Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There's been very little land reform. So when people actually have small plots of land, they're actually on somebody else's land. And they're not so much tenant farmers, but they're squatters. That's what they're considered. And that's why people have no power, because they don't really own the land, and they can be shooed off if they complain or whatever. So what you have is a few families that own the whole country. They're the judges, they're the teachers, they're the university professors. They have all, and then there's everybody else who are living in just absolute poverty. Yeah. And that's why the issue of land reform is so huge, because that means taking this land away from these rich landowners, and it hasn't happened so far, because every time there's a progressive government, like in Guatemala, that is voted in, the United States of America works with the reactionaries there to overthrow it. We can see that we saw that in Guatemala, I think it was 1954, and in Chile, you know, they're gonna take it back. I mean, and give it to the rich folks again. So anyway, like, I think there are 25 million people in Mexico City, but there are these huge slums where people do not own the land. They've just squatted there and built their houses, but they don't have any property. They don't have any of the legal documents, because they don't own the land.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so where were we?
So coming back to the United States
Right.
in around 1960, yeah, how were you taking in sort of what's going on nationally here and acclimating, making sense of? And were the schools that you were going to?
They were segregated.
Yeah.
They were segregated. And my mother actually fought to integrate the schools, because she was a Republican, but the Republicans at that time were the party of Lincoln. You know, she always saw herself as party of Lincoln. So, you know, my mother was an anti-racist, although later in life, before she passed away, she hired a She hired a caregiver that turned out to be incredibly racist, and she became a racist. I mean, she was completely dependent on him. So that was very sad to me. But yeah, and we lived in Sarasota was very segregated, still is. You know, Florida is a very racist state. So the black folks lived in Newtown, and there were certain jobs that they could get, like, you know, domestic servants, and we always had. My mother had like one person that came and did the laundry and did the ironing and helped her clean and stuff like that. And I remember when I first came and I saw what was happening in the civil rights movement, that I actually went to the person that was organized. I said, I want you to know that I don't think there's any difference between you and us, and I don't feel the way, you know, when I'm watching on TV. I don't feel that way. I feel we're completely equal. Now, I didn't talk about it in school, you know, my feelings, but like I said, I had a completely different worldview than most people because I hadn't grown up here.
Mm-hmm.
So my first year I was very difficult because, as I say, people saw me as so different from them. First of all, I didn't speak English really well. I was having trouble in school because I just didn't know, you know, when we do math, I didn't understand inches and feet. But I can remember, and also 7th and 8th, in junior high school, I stayed after school almost every day to either work on math or spelling or something, to get tutored. But I think when I was in that last part of the 6th grade, I felt very out of it. I mean, I didn't have friends. People just thought I was weird. So that was very difficult. And my older brother was sent away to school in Miami. And he did his junior high and high school at a boys' school in Miami. I can't think of the name of it. Because Woody really did not like Jim and wanted him out of the house. In fact, he started going to boarding school when he was 5 years old in Peru.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that just bolstered his anger. He was just always bitter, and he still is, unfortunately, because he hasn't been able to rise above it and see why, you know, things happen. Instead, he's still reacting to the past. But only much later, like my daughter was a professional dancer, ballerina out of high school, and she got a job at the Sarasota Ballet in Sarasota. And during that time, my younger sister, whose name's Elizabeth Woodsmall, was contacted by a guy named Woodsmall, that said, "Do you by any chance know Woody Woodsmall?" He says, I'm contacting everybody with that last name because it's so rare. He said, my mother was married to Woody, and after she had me, Woody walked out the door one day and we never saw him again. He never came back. So we realized that Woody, every time he would see Jim, he thought of the son he had abandoned. So he didn't want Jim around because he didn't want to be reminded of what he had done. Now, interestingly, it turns out that this son was a NASA engineer and had done very well in his life, but just was wondering. And Elizabeth said, "You did not miss anything." And I guess they corresponded for a while. And she let him know, no, you did not miss out because you did not have this father. And my younger sister, Elizabeth, is also bipolar. And she has suffered with the real mental and emotional issues her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hereditary, evidently. But anyway, that explains why Woody was so mean and just didn't, you know, he really just didn't even want to see us. He would say, "Get them out of here." Sometimes when the kids were in the same room he was. Yeah. I don't want to feel responsible. You know, and it's just, he was not a very aware, obviously, self-aware human being. But he was a great engineer.
Right. Or complicated.
Uh-huh.
And so after that 6th grade, 7th grade year, do you sort of, for lack of a better term, find your place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I had good friends. I have not kept up with any of them. I'm sure some of them are in Sarasota. I went to one high school reunion, but that was, I mean, and I lost track of the people I found again. But I was fairly popular in junior high and high. I loved school. I also, excelled in languages. So in junior high there was Portuguese and Spanish, and then in high school there was Spanish and French. And I took languages the whole way through, and that was huge for me. I had good friends and had a good social life in Sarasota. Although I always had issues around, I didn't have a boyfriend. I've always had issues around relating to men because of the whole issue with Woody. So that's been a lifelong issue for me, and my younger sister. I'm the only one, well, my older brother and I are the only ones that have been married, and we're the only ones that have children. And my nephew, my older brother's son, is 20 years younger than my children. So it took him a long time. But he's been a long time married. He found a wonderful woman who really loves him, has stuck by him. Because he has a lot of issues, not only relating to his childhood, but also to the war in Vietnam. Because he was in Vietnam, and he was among those that were dropped, from helicopters into fighting areas. And it really has affected his life. But he, they're upper middle class. He's done very well financially. They live out in New Mexico. And so he's the only one that's had a long marriage in the family. My younger brother and sister have never been married.
And how is your, how did you relate to the current events, like, of the time?
Well,
the early to mid 60s as you're in late middle school, high school?
I have always been very, very progressive. Not that I talked about it so much, but that's just the way I felt. My older brother is somewhat progressive, but my mother was a Republican. My stepfather, I don't have any idea what he thought about anything, but my Sam, my mother's stepfather, my second stepfather, was very conservative, and together they became more conservative, so I could never talk. One of the last things my mother said to me before she died, because she knew how much, she said, Roosevelt ruined the United States, and she knew he was, I just think the world of him, but she just had to get the last word in about that. So I was always I was pro-civil rights. I was in fact, I was very good friends with a boy, Bob Ruckman, in high school. And I thought, he opened up to me that he was gay. And so very early on, I understood the whole gay issue and how it was impossible for him to come out to his family and all these things. But because we were such good friends and had just had so much fun together, I have always just, had this real affinity for gay men and gay people. And I have, the men that I'm closest to in this world are gay men, So I think that was a great gift and a great opening. But also, I've always fought for the rights of third world countries and developing countries, because I understood. So I've always been very progressive. And like in high school, we had this class called Communism versus Americanism. I know, isn't that crazy? And because the people that had grown up in the United States were so afraid of anti-communism, because they'd seen the whole blacklisting and all this stuff, whereas I wasn't. And I would stand up in class, because when you answered a question when I was going to school, you had to stand up. And I'd say, this communism sounds really good to me. And all the people around me, this is like they were looking at me in utter fear, like you're going to be killed if you don't shut up, And people come back after the class and say, I can't believe how brave you are to say what you say in class. And I was just like, I'm sorry, but what is so bad about this? People wanting to have more equality. Not that, because the actual communist countries have just been dictatorships of the left, which is not what is progressive. What's progressive is having democracy, and people raising their consciousness to the point, like in the social democratic countries, where they vote themselves higher taxes because this is the kind of society they want. They don't want huge, I mean, they want to make sure that parents have family time off so they can raise their children. They want strong children, they want strong citizens, so they do this to make sure that people have education and child care, and that you take care of everybody, whether they can take care of themselves or not, and the whole 9 yards. But you do that through elections because that's what you want for the whole society. So anyway, that was, it's a real disappointment what happened in the Soviet Union and China.
And also during any time, there's a lot happening culturally in terms of music and film and books, literature. What was there any types of music, book, film, literature, art that you?
Well, there was incredible music as I was growing up, in this country during the '60s. And for a long time at the community center, there were dances on Friday and Saturday night where they would just basically play records and people would go and dance. And I always loved to dance because I grew up in Latin America where everybody danced. And I loved the music of the era. I know in terms of my own self, I sang in the choir, so I loved to sing. And my mother and I would sing together. She's taught me how to sing because she sang with Robert Shaw Chorale. And we would get records from the various musicals that were on Broadway, and we'd memorize them, we'd sing them through in the house. And I was also very devout Episcopalian, and I sang religious music at home, And I also had got Joan Baez and Bob Dylan records and learned all the music and sang to those. I also got all the Lynn Ronstadt records and memorized them and sang to them. And there's this wonderful documentary out about it right now. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's fantastic. So yeah, and I not only during junior high and high, but later, like in college, I would, and even when I was first married, my kids were really young, I would sing in the house all the time. So that was big for me. And I didn't think I could do it, but I loved to go around and look at the galleries in downtown Sarasota and on Siesta Key. So looking at art and wishing I could do art was a big part. That was sort of like a secret aspiration. Now it turned out that I married, my first husband was an artist, and he became a very well-known artist. And he's the one that encouraged me to do art. So since I was 19, I've been an artist myself.
And how did you meet him?
So
and what is his name?
His name is Robert Fichter, Fichter. I met him. I went to college at University of Florida in Gainesville. But that was the first time I had been away from my younger brother and sister. And I was sort of their protector, because my mother could get very abusive, so I would go and talk to them and say, Mom can't help it. She's under a lot of stress. But when I was at college, my sister especially would write to me and tell me how hard it was for her and how she was being abused and locked out of the house. And so my college time at that time was so wrapped up with my feeling so guilty for leaving my younger brother and sister behind. And I had told my mother, I would try to talk to her, and I would kneel down by her chair and I'd say, Mom, if you don't stop treating Elizabeth and Wilson well the way you do, Will's going to end up in prison, and Elizabeth's going to end up in mental hospital. You've just got, because I was seeing their psyches being destroyed. Also my older brothers. But she couldn't see it. Anyway, my younger brother did end up in prison, and my younger sister had mental problems her whole life. Anyway, but while I was there at University of Florida, a friend of mine who I got to know called Paige, he was actually, so the first year I was on campus. Second year, I could move off campus, so me and two friends from Sarasota, Carol and Judith Rosenbaum, rented an apartment, and we were living there in downtown Gainesville. And Judith,
this is like 67?
67.
Okay.
Yeah. Judith was dating this guy called Paige Pinnell, who I really liked. He had grown up in Gainesville. His father was the postmaster general of Gainesville. And he kept saying to me, Marjorie, you've got to meet this guy that's down here from Eastman House Museum of Art. He's teaching for a year for Jerry Ulsman, who was the head of the photography department at University of Georgia. And I don't know if you've seen his work, but it is just amazing, amazing work. He's just an amazing photographer. And I say, no, I don't want to be set up. You know, as I told you, I've always been really shy around men and just not knowing how to operate. And so one night, we were just all going out to do something, and he invited Robert and I together. And it was just an immediate connection. I did not know at that time that he had a girlfriend up in Rochester who had a daughter my age. And I think that's what it was really about.
Was he much older?
He was 9 years older than I
Okay.
was. So anyway, we started this affair. And then come time for, I guess in December, I can't remember, no, it must have been at the end of the last semester, I can't remember what that was, May or something. He went back to Rochester. And I basically, and then Paige had gone up to Atlanta with Vista, which was a volunteer organization that worked in poor areas to try to do youth work. And so Judith had left and gone up to Atlanta. And then Carol followed, and she went up to Atlanta.
Who's Judith?
So Judith and Carol Rosenbaum were my roommates.
Okay.
So Paige, Judith's girlfriend, moved to Atlanta. So then Judith moved up, and then Carol moved up. And I basically had kind of like a little mental breakdown because Robert was gone. I didn't know what a big deal it would be for me. And we kept corresponding, and my feeling just grew for him. So I dropped out of school and moved up to Atlanta. So this was spring of '68. And Judith and Carol, what was on 14th Street at that time were these like rooming houses. There's still some there. Maybe a couple, I don't know, I haven't driven down the street for a long time. But the Bird was in a house that basically had 4 apartments. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it also had a big basement.
Mm-hmm.
Right next door, that's where Judith and Carol had rented the upper right-hand apartment. So I moved in with them. So there were 4 apartments. And Paige would come over and he'd say, Margie, you've got to come over here and work for the Bird. They say, you would love the layout. They need people, they need staff members. Come over. So finally, I went over to the Bird house. And
so you moved here in like May of '68?
No, early '60, like February or March.
So right as the Bird is starting?
Yeah, right as the Bird is starting. So.
And Paige was already plugged in?
Paige was plugged in. There was Ann and Howard Romaine, Stephanie and Tom Coffin, and Jean and Nan Guerrero.
Mm-hmm.
They were the principals. And then there were other people around them, like Bill Fibbin, who turned out to be an incredible photographer, and his wife, Linda Fibbin. I can't remember who else, but that's when I met Ann and Howard, Jean and Nan, and Tom and Stephanie back then. And so they asked Linda and I to sell ads for the Bird. Now, they had already gone around and found, like, there were different head shops, and there was a gay men's store in downtown Atlanta. So there were a number of businesses they had already talked to. So we would go and we'd find out what size they wanted it to be. We'd collect the money. We'd do the layout for the ad. And so that's what Linda and I did.
Do you remember what some of the businesses?
If I open up a Bird to that era, I can tell you exactly, And you'll notice in the beginning, it's the same venues that keep buying from us. Because 14th Street was basically all these head shops. There was the 12th Gate. There were a number of businesses that catered to hippies, radicals, you know, progressives, whatever. And we didn't consider ourselves hippies. We consider ourselves radicals, you know. Then, shortly after that, because we were doing a lot of reviews of records and venues that played music, and record company got in touch with the Bird and said, we want a full page ad for, I think it was Stephen Miller was the first one. So then, you know, our attention shifted more to the record companies and the records, and they were a huge financial bonus to us until, I think Rick Brown, was it? Somebody started a newspaper that turned into Creative Loafing that was just about the cultural stuff. So sort of took that away, the financing part of that away from us. That was like in 70.
3 or 4.
Yeah. As the Bird began to decline. But anyway, so that's how I got involved. Plus, I was writing to Robert, calling Robert. We were communicating, and he said, well, and I actually went up to visit him once, but it was like it had to all be done in secret because he was still with Hollis. Because evidently one time when he tried to break up with Hollis, she tried to kill herself and ended up in the hospital. So he was scared to death of breaking up with her.
Did she know that
No.
there was another woman?
No. And also Robert was very strong personality-wise. And he was an up-and-coming artist in the United States, you know. And he said, well, I think I'm going to be offered a job at UCLA. Will you come out to California with me? And this is still all secret. But that's one way he felt like he could up and leave and not break anybody's heart. So I said, yes, I would like to. And so he got the job, and he came through here. I think we went out there in August. So he came through here, picked me up, and we drove out to California.
So you had only been in Atlanta for
a few months.
Yeah.
So let's say February, March, April, May, June, July, August. So 6 months.
Yeah.
But long enough that I had made really close friendships.
Yeah.
With these folks, and there were folks around the Bird too that I knew at that time.
And tell me what your impression of Atlanta at that time, and describe what it looked like, what the geography was, where you would socialize, where people were living.
Yeah. You know what? I need to take a break right
now.
Yeah. Then we'll go ahead for that.
Okay, so we're just coming back from a little break, and I was asking you to just describe Atlanta in all its facets. Your impressions when you got here.
Yeah, you know, I had just lived, even though I had lived in capitals abroad, they were really small towns, you know, compared to what Atlanta is now. And Sarasota was a very small town. Now it's gotten much bigger. But I think that the total population was like 30,000. You know, you could get to everything real easily. So Atlanta was a big city to me, even though compared to what it is now, it certainly was not. And there were several movie venues, and I love movies, and there were several music venues that we could go to. So I loved Atlanta. Also, you know, we were right down the street from Piedmont Park, which was the biggest park in Midtown, downtown Atlanta, where there were free concerts. You know, it was just much more relaxed. It was much smaller. It was easy to get around. There was not a lot of traffic. Now, it was very conservative, but I was embraced by this large group of progressive people, because the Great Speckled Bird was the progressive center for Atlanta. It was not just a newspaper. It was people could come in and drop in and talk about things, and sort of like, you know, we had progressive lawyers, progressive doctors, nurses, the people that worked in the military that would just drop by. So it was like a progressive hub. So I did not feel the sense of the conservative, you know, the folks around us. And also I made really good friends because for once, because I've been such a progressive even as a child, that to be around these people who felt the same way that I did, that I didn't have to argue with or just be careful not to talk about certain things around, it was an oasis for me. So I loved it. And that's why I came back here after my marriage didn't work out.
And did you have a car when you?
I did. I had I can't think of the name of it now. But because my mom wanted me to drive my brothers and sisters, especially my younger brother and sister around, she bought me a car. In Florida, you could get your learning permit at 14, and I did, and you get your driver's license at 16. So my mom got me a car, a 1956 Dodge to begin with, but this was another car. I think it was a used car, but it worked.
But you had a way to get around.
I had a way to get around.
So you weren't just
and so I had
sort of confined to the Strip.
No, so I had actually driven from Gainesville to Atlanta with all my stuff, and moved in next door to the Bird with Judith and Carol Rosenbaum.
And how did your mom and your siblings respond to this big move to Atlanta?
My mother had actually really come out of her sort of really serious alcoholic phase when she started working for CBS radio station and then later for the school board. You could just see that she just had a lot more self-confidence because she'd actually gone out in the world and resolved these terrible issues that, because here she had 4 kids and she had a crazy husband. And she was doing very well financially too, because she got a lot of advertising through the program that she did for women. And she'd gotten a lot of gifts from these companies. So, she was, and also she passed this millage vote in Sarasota to raise the money for the school system. And that was really near and dear to her heart. So she came and visited me once in Atlanta during those early years. And I guess I was just in communication with my younger brother and sister, and both of them were not going in good directions. But I think because I'd had this affair with Robert that I was more removed, and I had been away from this terrible sense of responsibility I had for them for a while. And none of the really bad stuff had happened yet. So I wasn't too worried about them. I think my main area of focus was first the Bird and the work I was doing for them and just getting to know these folks. And Robert. So Robert came down to visit a couple times, and I went up on a secret mission to visit him in Rochester. And the reason I did is because Howard Romaine told me I needed to go to New York City and talk to all the record executives. And he had the addresses, of the places I was to go. So I went up to Rochester and stayed with Robert for a few days, and then I guess I took a bus to New York City. And here, me in my little hippie clothes, I didn't have anything professional, and it was pouring down rain the day I went to New York City. And I would go up to these offices, and the receptionist would look at me like, "Who are you? You little wet gnome," And I'd say, "I need to talk to so-and-so." Say, "What about advertising for the Great Speckled Bird?" "What?" I was just laughed out of these. And I thought, I will never trust Howard Romaine again, because he was, "You can do this, and they want to hear from us, and they put ads in our paper, and these executives need to know." Oh my God, it was just the opposite of that. So that was a huge, humiliating life lesson from Howard Romaine. Anyway, so I think I went back to Rochester for a couple of days, and then I went back to Atlanta. Yeah.
And then fast forward a couple months, and you're moving to California.
Right. So I'm now living with Paige Pinnell at his co-op house, and I don't know why. I guess because they had an actual room.
Oh, so you had moved?
I had moved to close to where it was in the south side of Atlanta, which was very rough back then. But again, I don't remember that piece because I was going into a home with a lot of friends and stuff.
And this was housing established through Vista.
Well, yeah, it was
Or-
something that he could get through Vista.
Yeah.
But it had a number of bedrooms and there were a number of people living. Oh, I know what it was. He broke up with Judith and he was dating Summer, what's her last name? Brennan, who was Susan Brennan at that time. Have you heard of Paige Pennell of Susan Brennan? Brenner.
I've heard of Paige. I hadn't, but when he passed away a year or so ago,
Yeah.
I read some obituaries.
Right. So he and Susan Brenner, and she was a writer, and she's actually published a number of things, including books of poetry. She's been in San Francisco. But what they moved to, but this is after Robert and I left for California, but Paige did his master's program at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and Susan moved out there with him. But anyway, so Robert came by and picked me up, and we moved out to Los Angeles, and he had a job in the photo department. He was a photo professor. He was a photographer that linked photography with all kinds of other, like printmaking and drawing. And he, when we were out in California, he and this very famous, his name is Todd Walker, commercial photographer who'd done very well in Los Angeles, linked together because they wanted to recreate the photo emulsions that you could paint on watercolor paper that had been used in the past, like Blueprint, and there were several others. And what they did is they went back to the old books. They figured how you could put them together now where you could buy the chemicals, and they experimented until where there were several photographic emulsions that you could just paint onto surfaces. And to make pictures with those, you would actually get large format cameras and make big negatives. And what Robert did during those years is he was working mainly with Blueprint, and he would paint with Blueprint on a number of pages of watercolor paper, and then he'd plunk down the image he was looking at, and we would use the sunlight to expose it. Then he would go back in with watercolor or other medium and draw around it. So his work is very experimental, very esoteric. But also, he was a real big personality. His background or heredity is German. His great-grandfather was a pioneer into Florida. There was a German community. So he was a real Floridian. I mean, his great-grandfather, grandfather, father had all been Floridians, and he had grown up in Gainesville, Florida, and his mother and father owned a lot of land there. And his father actually built, with his own hands, this cement block house that they lived in Gainesville. So very much hands-on, self-made, tremendous energy, tremendous confidence, positivity, very generous person. But we got to Los Angeles at the time of the free love movement. So I would walk down to see him, because I was taking classes at UCLA too, during my lunch break, and there would be like 3 or 4 women hanging on him that he was giving instruction to. And then I'd come home, and he'd have one of his students sitting on the couch real close to him. He was critiquing her work, and I just felt totally lost. I've never been in a big city before.
Yeah, because what did you think of LA?
Oh my God, it was terrifying. Now I was there for 3 years, and first time I got on the freeway, I couldn't get off because it was like 5 or 6 lanes of traffic going 70 miles an hour really fast, and I didn't have the nerve to get over. So I got a big map of Los Angeles, and I learned how to go surface roads, and I always rode surface roads unless I absolutely had to get on the freeway because it was just overwhelming. So just Los Angeles itself was overwhelming. Also, here was Robert. He was up and coming in the art world, very well thought of. People at UCLA just, ogled over him. And I was this little nobody, very shy, 19 years old, and just lost and terrified all the time that I was going to lose Robert because he really had a wandering eye. Besides everything, it was just being like, come get me. So I lived with that, although very, I was very anxious and very insecure. And his final offer to me was, and we were getting ready to come across to Gainesville, where we came every summer because he taught at Penland Craft School in North Carolina. He taught photography and printmaking there, so we would come across every summer.
And were you married already?
Oh yeah, so in 1968 we drove out to California. Then that December we flew back to Gainesville and we got married at his home in Gainesville. So, a lot of his friends and my family came up from Sarasota, and that's where Mom and Sam got together, which was another big thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we got married, but I knew his heart wasn't in it, but he had a great sense of obligation or responsibility, I think he felt for me, because we'd had this affair, etc. So the last offer he made to me in LA before we came across country was, I'm going to get an apartment for you, and I'm going to get a studio downtown, and I'll be at the apartment 3 days a week, and the rest of the time, I'm not going to see you, and you don't have any say over what I do. You're not going to know what I do. And here I am, 19, going, no, this is not going to work. So we came across to Gainesville, and I developed this incredible allergy on my legs where I had these big welts. And he was going off to Penland. He said, this year I don't want you to come to Penland with me.
And this is like in your third year, so this is
third
like
year.
71 or?
71. Oh, and right before he left for Penland, Judith Horton, I don't know if you've done her interview.
Mm-mm.
Judith Horton, and her then boyfriend, Hank, and I can't think of his last name, but Henry and Robert were old friends. So they came to stay at Robert's house in Gainesville with us. And there, Henry broke up with Judith. And Judith said, I don't know where I'm going to go. I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, Judith, there's this great group of people around the Great Speckled Bird in Atlanta. I can give you, put you in contact with them. I put her in contact with Nan, who had an extra room. And so Judith put everything in her car and drove up to Atlanta. I guess that was like June or something. Then Robert went off to Penland, and I kept calling him saying, I want to be with you, I don't feel good. So I finally went up there, and he was having an affair with somebody and didn't stop having an affair with them. So at that time we had 2 cars. He had a Saab, and I had, both of them were his, but I drove what was called the pig truck, which was a turquoise Dodge van that was kind of banged up but worked. And so I took that Dodge van and I drove back to Gainesville. And shortly after that he came back from Penland and he said, I don't want to be with you anymore. You need to move out and find your own way. So I called Nan. This was September '71, and I put everything I had in the pig truck and I drove up to Atlanta. And
Did you have everything in Gainesville, or
no, and what?
Did you just leave your stuff in LA?
I just left my stuff. Never saw it again. And I was so hurt. But I knew it was because of who I was. I knew that I just couldn't match up to him. I couldn't be like him. I'm not an extrovert. I'm not a leader. I'm not a famous person. So I came to Atlanta. And in fact, I had met Steve and the girl he was going with at that time, Ann Jenkins, when I came to, well, he and Ann moved to Atlanta before I left to go with Robert. And they had actually moved into the house where I was with Paige. And I remember, meeting Steve and thinking, this is one of the kindest, sweetest human beings I've ever met. And he was just really interested, I mean, not sexually or anything, but just really interested in me, wanted to know my history, and that's just how he is. And that's why, he can make. So I kind of had a crush on him, although I hadn't seen him for those years, when I moved to Atlanta. But at that point, he wasn't going with Ann. Ann was with her now husband, Tom Perry. We started doing things together, like going to the 12th Gate, because he loves music.
Yeah, which was a coffee house music.
Yeah. But I mean, they had great acts. He can tell you who was playing there, but I mean, it's just all these people that turned out to be really famous jazz and folk musicians.
Before we dive back into Atlanta, tell me a bit about your life in LA and what you were doing sort of socially and how you were interacting with that city.
So I was incredibly intimidated. And at that time I had really long hair. And I could think of things, because Robert was off teaching. And I was home a lot. I was going to school, but I was just taking classes.
In what area?
Well, to begin with, just general studies. And then I started taking art classes, and I just loved it. And Robert had always been very supportive about my artwork. And so I just kept doing more and more and going, my God, I think I can do this, So not only was I doing photography, but I was doing drawing and painting. And Robert had a dark room in the house. So, I also did dark room work. I was doing black and white, but I would also hand color the black and white. And he was very experimental, like with fisheye lenses and double exposures. And he taught me all these different methods. Although I never took a photography class in Los Angeles, just because I had it all at home. But I really started loving drawing and painting. And that was a big part of what I was doing at school, although I never showed it. But Robert had a very gregarious, had a large group of friends, and we had a couple of, good couple friends, and we would basically go over to their house a lot, and they'd come over to our house, and we'd cook dinner and that kind of a thing. Later, my younger brother, who had a traumatic incident in Sarasota. Well, in the meantime, my mother had gotten together with Sam. And Sam was teaching at the University of Florida in Gainesville, in the medical school. So she left my younger brother and sister and moved up to Gainesville.
Moved?
They were in junior high school.
Living at home?
Living at home in Sarasota.
Did they have, the housekeeper was still there?
No. So they started getting, doing wild parties. They were very disturbed.
In the late 60s?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And, my sister, I could tell, was just getting more and more detached from reality. And my younger brother was getting more and more adventuresome in a bad way, And I thought, and I tried to talk to my mother. I said, Mom, you can't do this. I'm going to be with Sam. I deserve, something. I've lived in this. And I said, no, but when Elizabeth are kids, you can't just leave them. Sam and I have discussed it, and it was always like, Sam, Sam the psychiatrist, what do you know? I'm married to a psychiatrist. Anyway, I lost any control, and she certainly didn't listen to me. She was not going to give up Sam. So they started going way downhill. I know that my sister got pregnant at 17, and Mom flew her up to New York. And Ruthie's husband was a doctor. He was a obstetrician, gynecologist. He did, or he found somebody to secretly, do the abortion. My younger brother was hanging out with a really bad crowd. But one day, Woody came to the door and asked Will for money. And Will told Mom, and she said, you talk to that, blah, 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 blah. Don't be stupid, but Dad doesn't have any money. And evidently he was shucking oysters for money, Woody was, because he had come out of the mental hospital with no job and no references or anything, you know. So he became a derelict on the streets of Sarasota and did these odd, very difficult jobs to make money. And I'll tell you the later story of his death. But so Will asked if he could come and live with us. And my sister had actually spent 2 summers with us before that. So here's the other difficulty with the relationship, is that I felt responsible for my younger brother and sister. And I was in this marriage to this high-powered, up-and-coming artist.
But you're 19, 20,
Yeah.
raising teenagers.
Exactly. So Will came up to live with us. And I think those are the two things that broke the camel's back, you know, is that Robert realized that I felt responsible for these kids. And, you know, he didn't even want children because he was in a different phase of his life. So I think that's also what made it impossible. But I didn't even think about that much later, that I detached myself enough to know this isn't normal, you know.
Were you exposed to or aware of the underground press in LA while you were there?
No,
or?
I was aware of the farm workers organizing, and I actually joined a group in Los Angeles that was supporting the farm workers that were doing strikes and demonstrations and stuff. But the guy in charge of it was so macho and looked so down on the women in the group that I was very short-lived. Although I did, you know, they had a grape strike, they had a lettuce strike, and I was basically all for that, and, you know, talked to my friends about not buying, you know, boycotted products and stuff like that, and followed it on the news.
Mm-hmm.
But I was not aware of the underground press.
And did you connect in any other ways with the large Mexican American, other Latin American communities in?
Well, one of our close friends came from South Los Angeles, and he and his wife were actually living in his family's home where he had grown up. Only his mother, his parents had not allowed him or his brothers or sisters to speak a word of Spanish. So even though he had a Spanish name and was, like, I guess, 2nd generation or 3rd generation Mexican, you know, he did not know a word of Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so funny because people on the street would stop us and go to him and start talking in Spanish, and he said, I can't speak Spanish. And of course they would just get really angry, but I could talk to them in Spanish, you know. So it was Virgil Morano couldn't speak a word of Spanish. What were we talking about? Oh, I was at UCLA when Angela Davis was giving her talks on campus. So I went to those talks. I mean, you know, she would start speaking and a group of people would gather. So there were all these kind of campus activities that I would join in on. But I wasn't aware of anything, you know, off of campus. I wasn't, you know, connecting to, because like I say, I'm not a very assertive person. So I would have had to go out, you know, and introduce myself to folks, and I'm just don't have it in me.
Yeah.
But I was connected with what was going on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And also then first my sister was there in the summers, and then my younger brother came to live with us. So that was another worry of mine, you know, or like responsibility of mine.
Did he move back with you, your brother?
Yep,
Yeah.
he did. And he was in Gainesville for a while, then he went to Panama City. Then he and some friends robbed a store. And then all of his friends admitted they were guilty, got a public defender, and Will refused to, because he said we all made a pact, and I don't believe what you're saying, that they said they would turn state's evidence against me. So Mary Joyce Johnson, I don't know if you've heard of, because I was already back in Atlanta. I don't know if you've heard of Mary Joyce Johnson, but she was an attorney, and she's been a progressive attorney her whole career. She's now in D.C. Came down to St. Augustine with me, and we tried to talk to Will. We said, Will, all of the people you did this with have turned state's evidence. And you need to do the same, because the public defender will take you all, you'll do a plea deal, and you'll get out, much faster. He refused. So he went to trial. He was found guilty, given 10 years for armed robbery. And the rest of the kids got like 2 months in county jail, and Anyway, it was so sad for me, because, I had tried for so many years to help my younger brother and sister, but they kept going down the direction they were going, and there's nothing I could do. But when my son was born, his name is Wilson, but we called him Will. So for the first year, every time I would say his name, I'd just break out crying. I mean, I couldn't say his name, so I would call him like tortilla chip and frijole, and I couldn't say his name, because I would just be so sad about my brother. My mother and Sam finally got involved, although they felt no responsibility, because Will called me when he got in trouble. He didn't call them. So I tried to get, the help and everything. But they actually came up with the bail to get him, out of jail until the trial. And he came up and lived with Steve and I, of course. But anyway, he did have to eventually go to jail, and my mother had a lot of influence in Sarasota. She knew a lot. She was very big in the Republican Party and getting people elected, so she was able to move him out of the penitentiary where he was supposed to go to really low, I don't know how you call it, one of the better jails. I can't remember what you call them, in Central Florida, where he actually learned dentistry, or there was a dentist that had him as an assistant. And I mean, he got some privilege. He got to play tennis and things like that. So he actually had a much cushier time than he would have. Mm-hmm. And then Mom and Sam would visit him once a month, and Steve and I came down several times to visit him. And then I think he only served 5 years, and then went to a work release program in Tallahassee, where his twin has lived for a long, long time. But my sister just hates her brother and thinks she's so above him, so they can't get along. But anyway, for this short time, she was kind of okay with him. But he was on work release, and he learned construction there. And he's been in the construction business ever since, and he now has his own business in Sarasota, Florida. Yeah, so Will, when he got into prison, and he told me this early on, he said he realized, that a third of the people should be there and should never leave, deserve to be there. 1/3 of the people could reform themselves and have a real life, and the other third should never have been in there. But he decided, I did something wrong, I was wrong, I've got to straighten myself out, and I will not be back here again. So he took responsibility. I think it was enough of a slap in the face, like they say, alcoholics have to hit rock bottom. Well, he had to hit rock bottom. Doesn't matter how mad you are about your life or whatever. You now are an adult, and you've got to take over from there. So thank goodness for that. And he's had a very hard time, because every time, like when he went for after he'd done all the work for each of the contracting licenses that he got, he had to stand before the board, and they'd say, we're not going to give you this license because you were a felon. And each time he said to stand up there and explain to them, I understand how you feel, I did my time, I'm a completely different person, I've done all this work. And then finally he got his contractor's license. But again, every single time they didn't want to give him a license to work. And I mean, it's just crazy, but that's how it is. So he suffered, his whole life for this. But he does not feel sorry for himself. He realizes he's the one that took those actions, and he's the one that has to respond to that. So anyway.
So you're back in Atlanta in late 71?
September 71.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where do you settle first?
Well, I moved from house to house. First, I'm living with Nan until her second husband, Charlie Orrock.
Because she had divorced by that point?
Yeah, and she'd been divorced for quite a few years.
Okay.
So Charlie had been working in the coal mines in Virginia, and both of them are from Virginia. And so Steve's from Virginia. And, you know, they all knew each other at the University of Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, Charlie was going to move into the room where I was, so then I moved to another friend's house close by while they were on vacation. Then I moved in with Ann and Howard Romaine, and I can't remember, it was another couple. And then I moved into a women's co-op with Judith Horton and Carol Brown and another woman whose name I can't remember. But no men were allowed in that house.
And where was that?
That was in Little Five Points.
And did the co-op have a name, or?
It probably, I'll have to ask Judith and fill you in because I can't remember the name.
Yeah.
But it was a time when there were all these, you know, gay co-ops and other co-ops. So then.
And what street was it on, do you remember?
It was on, when you get to the light, if you're going from Ponce down Moreland,
Mm-hmm.
you get to the light where there's this little shopping center right here. Do you know where I'm talking about?
I think so, the shopping center, like with the pharmacy and.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's that street. It was 2 houses down.
Okay.
And I can't remember, but when I see it, I remember that's the name of the street.
Yeah, I forget the name as well, but yeah.
So then Judith and Carol and I rented a house on Charles Allen.
Okay, so back midtown.
Right, Midtown. And I would walk from that house all the way straight through Piedmont, and now the part that's now the Botanical Gardens, to the birdhouse at that time, which was the one that was firebombed.
On Westminster.
On Westminster. And I lived there. Oh, I know. Then Steve and I started going together, like really going together. And he was living in a co-op on Sinclair with Bob Dorland and Candy Hamilton and Reaver Bolt and Roger Friedman.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so there just really wasn't enough room for me. Plus Steve at that time would wake up at 5 a.m. and start clipping newspapers. So I moved in with Ann Jenkins and Tom Perry down the street. They lived on Sinclair too, but down the street.
And is this all like within a year or so?
Yeah.
These different places that.
Yes. Because I don't remember when I rented the apartment on top of Ann Romaine on 7th Street, I believe. I believe Nan was on 9th Street and we were on 7th Street, something like that. Ann had a big house, and she and Rita Marie lived in the big house, and then there were 2 apartments. I lived on in one, and Steve started living with me there. And it was right before he went to, they were on their, he and Bob Malone were on their way to Chile. They had friends in Chile before Allende was killed. And but they were starting out by going to Mexico and going to a Spanish school there. So it was right before that he and I started living together on, I think it was 7th Street. Anyway, and I began working as a secretary, because the one thing I had learned to do in high school was I took a typing class. So I started working for Kelly Girl and just doing temporary jobs. Because Steve was heading off to Central America and he wasn't paying any rent, so somebody had to work, you know.
And what was Kelly Girl?
It was like a service,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
like a secretarial temp service.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got my toes in the water. And I didn't realize it, but I knew that Ann was working on her thesis from University of Virginia, because it was the last year she had, where the statute of limitations would run out if she didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I didn't know until many years later that was the year Steve would have had to stay home and write his thesis, which he chose not to do. Instead, he went with Bob Malone for Central America. Anyway, and then when they were in Cuernavaca at the university there, or the school, language school, Allende was called. So they just ended up traveling in Mexico and Guatemala. And Steve came back, and he had, what's it called? Hepatitis. Because he had done something that I told him not to do. I told him, don't eat off the carts because you're going to get germs in it, and don't eat any raw seafood. Well, you know, because I grew up in the third world, and my mother would always say this. So he ate oysters out of polluted water and ate at every street stand he could find. So he came back with hepatitis, was very sick, couldn't do anything. I think he couldn't do anything for 2 or 3 months. But anyway, he asked me to marry him when he got back. And I said yes. So anyway, what happened after that? So I started working and then shortly after that, oh no, we got married in 76. That must have been 75 when he went to Central America. I can't remember. I think it was because we got married in 76. No, we didn't. We got married in 74. We got married in 74, so it must have been 73.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when he went, 73, because we got married in 74. Because Wilson was born in 75, Maggie was born in 76. Yeah.
And were you, when you came, because you came back in 71.
Right.
And did you immediately start working as a Kelly girl?
No, I immediately started working at the Bird.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't start working, oh, I know what it was. When I got pregnant with Wilson is when I started. No, because I was working when Steve was away. So it must have been 73. So besides working at the Bird, which I think I got $20 a week.
And did you go back into the advertising?
No, I did layout. By that time, I think we were mainly doing like record ads and stuff like that. But I can't remember, but I didn't do that. I was working on layout and writing stories about food issues. Maybe I did start out in I can't remember, but I also did photography there. I worked in the dark room. So it was a number of things I did. Plus sold birds with Steve on the weekends to make more money. But I realized I had to make more money. So Sears at that time, it's now
Pond City Market.
Pond City Market was a real working Sears. And so there was a store on the bottom and the rest was a warehouse. You could hire out as an order picker during Christmas. And I think we were on roller skates. It was something like that. And basically picked orders and made a bunch of money during Christmas. I just realized I had to work more. I mean, I had to. So when we got the apartment where I was renting from Anne Romaine, which was the summer that he went away, I started working for Kelly Girl. Because he was saying, come with me. I'm saying, who's going to pay the rent? Who's going to,
I already speak Spanish.
Well, I wanted to go, but I
Yeah.
just felt like somebody had to be responsible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was it like coming back to Atlanta?
It was great. It was such a relief because I had been so insecure. I mean, I can't even tell you how insecure I was. And I just never felt Robert's friends were Robert's friends, and Robert's shows were Robert's shows. And he would go and visit all these famous photographers and teachers and never invite me. So I was really, and I think that's how his mother was. I think, and I know he really loved his mother, but I think she was just, and I met her and I loved her. And she, for years after he, divorced me, kept saying, Robert has a perfectly wonderful wife in Atlanta. She would not let go of that.
Did you all divorce immediately?
No, you know what? I got a divorce to marry Robert. To marry Steve.
Okay.
He really didn't want a divorce because he wanted to play the field and he wanted to tell people, I'm still married, I can't marry you because I'm still married. Yeah. So that's why we got the divorce, and I got the divorce. So it was a huge relief to be around people that liked me, that knew me, that liked me, where I had a place that was my own. And I was, very in love with Steve. Steve is much more emotionally distant, so he didn't fall in the same way. But for me, I think it was just like a neediness that came from, my childhood, and then also with Robert was like the absolute worst thing I could have done for my confidence. Yep, so I really enjoyed being back in Atlanta.
And what was the bird like when you came back?
It was much more developed. There were a lot more people on it. The staff meetings that we had every week were filled with people. And also there were a lot more strong opinions, strong voices and strong opinions. And I don't think I just went along with whatever the majority decided. I don't remember being very vocal in these meetings.
And what were the sort of strong opinions around what?
I can't remember, but just around what was going to go on the cover, whose articles were going to go in the Bird, because there were different factions. Jean Guerrero was a very loud voice. Tom and Stephanie were very strong voices. Seems like Roger was. But there was just like, should we put in this article about Black liberation, or should we put in this article about Loretta Lynn, or and there were just different people had different positions, and they argued about them a lot. It came out every week, and we would be friends the next day, but there was just a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about why this should go on over this, or why this cover instead of this one right now, and about the politics of the day and what was the most important thing to emphasize, etc. So it was very lively, and also it was a very lively place because people came in, and there were like student interns that came during the summer. There were a lot of different views on things, and there was also strong artists like Bill Fibbin and Carter Tomasi and others who were up and coming in the art world in Atlanta, and they had work to either go in or not go in that week, and so there were a lot of different voices. There were people like Jean Guerrero, who's really into country music. There are people like Miller Francis, who was really into culture and movie reviews, and so there were a lot of strong people and strong opinions.
Mm.
And for me, it was just like a great place to hang out and be and do whatever work needed to be done. And can you do this? And sure, can you do that? Yeah. So I was more like that kind of a person.
And how would you describe the women's role on the paper in the years that you were there? And if you, and what that role for you was like those couple months in '68 and then the years?
I think there was much higher consciousness when I came back. Because actually when Linda and I were asked to sell ads, it was because we wore miniskirts, So it was kind of, but I just wasn't developed enough emotionally or in terms of the women's movement, in terms of women's roles. I wasn't consciously aware. And so it was very different. When I came back to town, there was a women's group. And I remember we met at the Bird. I don't know if it was specifically around the Bird, but reading books and talking about women's issues. And so there were discussions about that at even at staff meetings when people were arguing for different things. And I think there were people that were much more consciously aware. I had grown up in such a culture of women are second-class citizens. Not that it was spoken like that, but that was just the fact, because women didn't have jobs they could do. I mean, they were basically housewives, and they basically just had to do whatever the situation called for to keep the kids alive and them alive, you know. Just like my mother, even though she was a very strong woman, and she, you know, did a whole lot in Sarasota politics, and she was on the League of Women Voters when we came back. She was, she did Girl Scouts, she did PTA, she worked on the Bay Restoration Program. I mean, she was very active socially and community-wise in Sarasota, and she was very well aware of the issues with women not having been raised to do work. But you know, there's some really strong, like Mary Birding. I don't know if you've met her or have heard of her. She had a study group, and one of the things we would read is about women.
Do you remember something that you read that really made an impact?
I don't, but I did a women's study to finish my undergraduate work at Vermont College, which was the only low residency certified program, or what do you call it when the college is certified to operate. There was no internet, so the only way I could finish my degree.
Correspondence course?
Yeah, it's called low residency independent study.
Okay.
But it was certified as you know how schools have to be certified to be able to give degrees that are honored. So this program was, but it was one of the few in the country. So you actually went up at the beginning of the semester, and you were with a group, and you talked about what you were going to do, what you were going to read. You set out the course of study, and then you sent your papers in, or you sent your pictures in, or whatever. And then you came back at the end, and you presented, and you were given a grade. So I went 3 semesters to Vermont College to get my undergraduate degree, because I was divorced at that time. But I can't remember specifically, but in that, in the course I took there, I read The Chalice and the Blade, I read Women's Ways of Knowing, I read The Death of Nature, which is again equating nature with women in third world countries, you know. So I developed much more understanding as the years went on and when I was reading. I read the new diary. I read, you know, a whole lot of things.
Yeah. But there was a group also.
There was a group in Atlanta, yeah.
And that met at the Bird House?
We met every week, and we talked about what we'd done, you know, where we were moving, what we wanted to see, like with the bird and with, you know, our own development. And Stephanie was very involved in that as well.
Do you recall anybody else that was?
I remember Linda was in that group. I can't remember if Nan was involved, because Nan, and there was then a group of people, including Steve, that was moving more to the left and moving more towards a communist perspective rather than the bird. And so I can't remember when those people drifted off from the bird to more of the, like the OL and other communist groups that were coming up, and went to work in factories and all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Was this group, there was a group in Atlanta called Women's Liberation, I've heard about. And I think they even have a house somewhere over around Briarcliff. I don't know if this...
You know, I didn't know of it. I mean, I knew of a number of women's cooperatives, living cooperatives. I knew of a number of gay women cooperatives. But it's all nebulous. I don't have the kind of memory where I remember, you know, it's all kind of images floating around.
Yeah.
You know, I also remember a very strong gay rights movement around the bird, and Miller Francis was a big part of it. And I remember talking to him a lot about, you know, what it was like to be gay. Now, of course, he's been in the Revolutionary Workers' Party for a long time, and I think, you know, I know he had to marry Lizzie, and they kind of negated his gayness. And I kind of feel like he's done that too. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I know they made them marry different. Because I knew a gay woman in that, well, Lizzie and there was another woman who was gay. They both had to marry a man. And Miller had to marry. So I know that that the group was in denial of, gay rights, I think. I mean, that's the way I view it.
Mm-hmm.
But then a lot of my friends that had gay relationships, like Judith and Carol, Judith has been married to Patrick for a long time. So there was a phase in some people's lives where they decided they were gay or they were going to get in a gay relationship. Now I know that more with women than I do with men. So I think my understanding of women's rights continues to this day in terms of what I read and just interested in. But I think the most profound book I read was The Chalice and the Blade, which is a book about the difference between power over and empowerment. And women represent empowerment, just like nature represents empowerment. It doesn't do what it does by having power over something. It's empowered. The seed and the soil and the rain empower the seed to become a tree. Mm. The tree doesn't hurt people, to get to be a tree. And this book, The Chalice and the Blade, was based on the work that Maria Gambutis, an anthropologist at UCLA, did on the goddess civilizations, and a comparison about the difference between the goddess civilizations and the male-centered civilizations. And also she traces it back to the hordes, which were really the herds of the Mongolians and others from the Far East coming over and taking over cities in Europe. So she dates it back to that era where the civilizations of empowerment, which were earth-based and mother-based, because both saw women as the givers of life, of children, and nature as the givers of all of our life. So it was a completely different perspective, rather than that power comes from power over. You control, you enslave, you berate, so the whole structure of mother and goddess-based civilization was completely different than male-based civilization. So that's probably been the most profound book I ever read, and I've always seen power relationships based on the theories in that book. And it makes a lot more sense to me. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to get back to. We have to get back to empowerment. That's when you empower everybody to be the best they can be. You don't put people down. You don't enslave them. You don't imprison them. You empower them. And in order for us to have one world, and the same way with nature, because I read this wonderful book called The Death of Nature, and it talks about the Age of Enlightenment and this changing worldview where we have the right to exploit this earth because we have this God-given right. God has given us power over the earth. And before that, it was much more what the indigenous view, which is we should be so grateful to the earth for giving us everything we need. And that's still where the indigenous people are, whereas Western civilization is all power over. The right to exploit. We can take everything. It belongs to us. Yeah, so we have to, in order to resolve the climate, we have to have a different view of the earth. The earth is not our garbage can. We cannot be like locusts on the earth. And we have to empower everyone in order to have that kind of earth. So, anyway. Yeah. That's a profound way I see women. And I think right now, and others have talked about it, the way we are evolving is to, women's empowerment is so part and parcel, just like the earth's empowerment. Like I know in New Zealand, they have now said that rivers should be protected because they are living beings. and all animals are sentient beings, it's not just us, human beings, but we have to empower all the rest of nature to have the value it really does, and have the rights it does. Because that's the way we keep clean water, and that's the way we keep the Amazon, etc. Anyway, I think that's the way we're moving, hopefully.
Yeah. On the subject of women and the bird, you had mentioned in part getting your first job at the bird in sales and marketing because of your appearance. I recall looking through the bird and seeing advertisements about, I guess they were like abortion referral services. Do you recall anything about those? Did you have any?
I don't. But I know that in terms of the bird, that we were always on the progressive side of everything that we see out there now. We were into cleaning up rivers. We were into environmental stuff. We were into riding bicycles. We were very conscious of all of the things that are now so important, like the environment and women's bodies and women's empowerment. So I bet there were. I just never needed them. But I know that Planned Parenthood was, it's very important in that sense, and we can see that the reactionary Republicans have now, stopped funding Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had a direct relation of those ads coming into the the paper.
I didn't.
Yeah. Back to the women's group that may have been related to the bird, but that was at least meeting there. Do you recall like sort of specific issues that were discussed, or was it? Do you recall if it was framed around like consciousness raising about talking your own experiences and relating it to a larger?
Yeah, I think it was that,
society?
and a lot of women at that time were either recently married or getting married and talking about, sharing household responsibilities and what kind of demands or what should be the discussion in terms of, women's empowerment at home and also around the bird. Maybe, things like women should be writing more articles, and women should be inserting their voices more in staff meetings, and just generally what was going on nationally at the time, and joining in demonstrations for women's rights, and just sort of becoming more and more aware of how women had been left out. Like the arts organization that I belong to, Women's Caucus for Art, was started in 1970 in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, because at that time there were so few women involved or in art history, even women that were working or in the museums or in the big galleries. So of course now it's almost, there are more women working in art than there are men, just like there are more women graduating from law school now than men. And there are a lot of women doctors being, graduated from medical school. So then it was just nascent. We need to get more women lawyers. We need to get more women reporters. We need to, see that we can do anything that we choose to do, rather than that we have to be in the background, just taking up whatever somebody asks us to do. Asserting ourselves more.
And when you had moved back to Atlanta and became re-involved with the bird, and then your relationship with Steve develops, how does your family respond to this change in your life and sort of confirmation that this is the path that you're taking?
So, oh, like my mother?
Yeah, and I guess your brother as well. You said that he had served in Vietnam, and the bird certainly had a very anti-war position.
Unfortunately, in my family, there are these huge rifts. Me with my older brother, starting at a very early age, he felt very jealous of me, because he was always being sent away from school. Also, we mainly lived in 3-bedroom homes, so I would have a room, Will and Elizabeth would have a room, and Mom and Jim would have to live outside of the house, usually in what was called the servants' quarters. Yeah. So this started in Peru, and where he was sent away to boarding school. Of course, I didn't put it all together, like understanding that Woody had abandoned his son and wife, and therefore he had a lot of issues with his own childhood that had never been resolved because he never talked about or to his parents, never talked about or to his sister. So clearly there was, and that Jim, and I told you that I felt like my job was taking care of my mother and my younger brother and sister. That meant that Jim was left out. And Jim was always being asked to, because in Latin America, I never walked out of the house without somebody with me. It was just too dangerous, that's what I was told. So usually it was my maid, but if it wasn't, like Jim and I were going to go to a party and Mom was going to drop us off, she would always tell Jim, take care of Marjorie. Make sure you're taking, because it was dangerous, and it still is, for a woman to go out in Latin America and just be by herself. So he felt like he was being rejected and pushed away, but then he was expected to take care of me. So there's always been this huge rift. And then when we were in Sarasota, he was sent away to boarding school. And, he was very lonely and felt very dejected. And he had to take the bus, like Trailways or whatever, to Miami and then back by himself. And he said most people were picked up by their parents. So he never was. So Jim has always been very angry with me. And a lot of it is that he projected his anger at my mom on me because it was just too dangerous for him to not have any relationship with my mother. So, up until very recently, if I ever saw him, he would hit me, he would kick me under the table. Just this incredible amount of anger would come out towards me. So we have very little relationship. And on the phone, he's always been very aggressive, very dominating, because it's like he feels so insecure he has to overcompensate. So it's just made it impossible just to have a normal friendship relationship. And my younger sister, again, she felt very jealous of me because, of course, my mother favored me because I felt like I was her servant. So, and my sister's only role then was to rebel. But when she went to school, she was angry, and also she had this issue, this bipolar issue. And so her teachers would always say, why can't you be like Marjorie? She was so nice, she was so polite, because I was always being the good girl, because if I was the good girl, that would make things so much easier for my mother and everybody. And so therefore she was the bad girl, so there are these huge rifts. And my younger brother and I have been good friends all our adult lives. Whereas my sister and I have a very difficult relationship. And she, a number of years ago, said, you're dead to me, So I'm just really happy that she's been in Tallahassee for a long time. She's in several groups, support groups. She's had counselors. She got her undergraduate degree, and she also got her master's degree. So my sister is incredibly brilliant, like my stepfather was. She's done all these amazing things, but then she's also spent years totally depressed and unable to do anything. She's done amazing things. She's an artist, and she illustrated 2 whole textbooks for 2 different professors at the University of Florida. One about Florida mollusks, which she did all the illustrations for, and one about Pompeii, where she went to Italy 3 summers and did illustrations from Pompeii that are part of this textbook. She's also been editor of the literary magazine in at the University of Florida. Florida State University. She's written and now she has a marketing degree and she does marketing for people. She does like stationery and cards, and she designs logos, and she designs web pages and a lot of marketing stuff for small businesses, etc. So she's brilliant. She can do everything. But again, I rub her the wrong way. I was able to get married, have 2 kids. I'm so lucky that my kids are very successful. So I was able to overcome, the trauma and the history of my family. She has felt like she's suffered with all of these issues that come from, her childhood. So I'm not really friends with my sister, and I'm not really friends with my older brother. It's sad.
Yeah.
But, that's the way it is.
And your mom and Sam at that time period?
I've had such a hard time with Mom and Sam, because Sam was a psychiatrist. And you would think that he would be thinking about my younger brother and sister, but he never did, and he always put them down. And he always protected my mother from them, meaning she didn't want to hear all the criticism and stuff from them. He always stood up for my mother and not them. So it was very difficult for me. Also, my mother was very controlling, and I never had a conversation with Sam. If she was in the room, I would say something to her, and then she'd go to Sam, "What do you think about this?" And then she would tell me his answer, even though he was sitting right there and I was sitting right here. And since I didn't want to get involved in that, I just let that happen. But
Do you get a sense of what they felt about your life choices and your political orientation?
They so looked down on me.
Mm-hmm.
And were often verbal about it, because they would come to, Steve and I's humble home, and they live a very well-off, they're both passed away now, a very well-off, upper middle class life, really spiffy homes, with really spiffy friends, having cocktail parties and stuff like that, which, I've never had in my life. So they just looked down their nose on us. And tried to correct me all the time about my parenting, which was really hysterical. And buy the children books, that they thought would help the kids see, what was wrong with us. And So, no, she had no respect for me, and would try to put her conservative politics out, mainly to just say, you're so wrong, just like I said about Roosevelt, So we actually saw the world in probably just completely opposite terms. For her, it was important to be, well-liked, and to have the things that showed that you've done well in the world, and, for Steve and I, it just never was. For me more than, for Steve more than me, he has no pretense, no vanity, he just is who he is, and totally unapologetically. I probably pushed more of the things of, being more successful, etc., like with my kids, and both of them are. So I think with my kids we did great, because we're just, we have very different strengths. So both of my kids have his incredible brain, his incredible memory, and they have my chutzpah. They get up and go to work every day. They, push forward. Whatever needs to be done, they do it, and they're very successful, monetarily as well as in their work. So. I couldn't ask for anything more.
Yeah. And by the point you were in Atlanta, your first stepdad, he had already died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Actually, he died shortly after the divorce that Steve and I had. He'd actually been a derelict living on the streets of Sarasota.
Yeah.
And Sarasota Memorial Hospital, which is was the only hospital in Sarasota, called my mother one day and said, "We have somebody in here named Woody Woodsmall, and we can't find anybody connected to him except we found you as his former wife. He's on ventilation, he's going to pass away very soon. Do you want to see him? And she actually contacted both Will and Elizabeth. She didn't contact me because he was their father, and said, do you want to come to the hospital with me? And he had oxygen, and he couldn't talk. I don't know if he was able to talk, but he couldn't talk. And Mom and Elizabeth went, and they told him, that I was married and I had 2 kids, and where Jim was. They was in Albuquerque, and he was married, and I don't think he was married yet. No, he wasn't married yet. They held his hand as he passed away. And then my sister actually went to the address where he was living, and it was this abandoned building. He had a roommate, but it was just like open air. The windows didn't have any glass in them, and there's just a concrete structure that I guess homeless people lived in. And he had a sterno burner, and there were a bunch of empty cans of beans and stuff around. So that's how he lived, and there were 2 mattresses on the floor. So that's basically how he ended up.
Mm-hmm.
And he was hit by a car. That's how he ended up in the hospital. So after Mother left him that last time, he had fallen so much. And Sam would always say, he would not take his medication. So, and he loved to go to bars, and I'm assuming that when he got his Social Security or whatever he was living on, that's what he would spend it on. Mm-hmm. Until it ran out, and then he'd wait for the next month. I guess. I mean, I don't.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
But and it just shows you, if you want to overcome the circumstances you find yourself in, you've got to do a lot of work. You got to work on yourself, And some people can do it, and some people just don't. So when I see homeless people, I go, they're but for fortune, because that happened to my father, who was a brilliant engineer.
Right.
Who at one time was living high, and gambling at big gambling houses, and
Yeah, and jet setting all over the
Right.
world. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So back to the bird, are there any specific issues of the bird, or topics, or advertisements or pieces of art that are most memorable to you or meaningful?
The most meaningful thing to me is all the research the Bird did and the articles they did about the current events and really predicting the way things were going. Like when I got onto the Bird in 1971, I can't think of the man, but he never married, and he's exposed a lot of stuff about products and about farming and stuff his whole life, and he's still alive now, and I think he ran for president one time. Can't think of his name.
Nader?
Nader.
Mm-hmm.
He had written a book about the introduction of hormones and antibiotics into livestock, and the introduction of massive amounts of pesticides into factory farming, and also the beginning of factory farming of animals. And I wrote an article about that, but just the fact that the Bird would say, I'd say, I'm really interested in food, organic food, and natural living, and they'd say, well, Nader's done this book, why don't you read that and write an article about it? And so a lot of people learned a lot just by those kinds of things. Or, like Ann Jenkins and Tom Perry got really involved in bicycling, and Tom Perry is still into it, and Tom and Stephanie, again, people took on different areas, and they've lived it their whole lives. So I think that's what was really fascinating to me, is there was just a lot of learning, a lot of interest, a lot of research, and also because they were the gathering progressive place, like when there was a cleanup of a stream, you knew where to go that Saturday to do that. Or when a co-op popped up so that you could all buy vegetables and stuff much cheaper, you would know where that was and what its hours were. And so Steve and I were in a club like that for decades. And it was before all of the farmers markets that you now see. And, you know, we would take turns on like going to the farmers market, the south of Atlanta, and buying produce really cheaply, coming up, dividing it out for people. Sometimes we would be responsible for the store. No, we worked as a co-op, and we took different jobs, and so we could live really cheaply. And that was the other thing, is just living really humbly and cheaply. And of course, my daughter says, "Oh, my mama was a hippie chick." You know, she wouldn't live like that for anything in the world. But you know, I loved all of that because I came up in a Southern middle class family where people weren't nice to, and you know, people weren't nice to each other, and they didn't care about where food came from, or they didn't care that there were people poorer than them. You know, and there was just a lot of this humility and living simply and caring about the earth that still carries over in all of the people that worked at the Bird. I mean, you think of Mickey and Henry. You know, he was a doctor, she was a nurse midwife, but they lived very humbly and always have. So the people that were around the Bird, the attorneys, they were just very different from the normal attorney that only cared about money, you know. And that was, so it's those values and the way people really live them, and it was the knowledge, the seeking of like the most progressive view of like the environment or nuclear waste, you know, all of these things that we covered. And it was just very exciting to be around all that information and be around all these caring people. So to me, you know, when the Bird was alive and I was working on the Bird, I was living my values.
Right.
Which I had never been able to do before because I had a whole community in back of me. And I still feel that way. You know, I mean, these things still matter to me, and they matter to me my whole life, you know. So that's why I love the Bird, and that's the kind of community that I love being in. So even though, you know, we have disagreements or whatever with these folks, my profound respect for their choices, for the way they live their lives, I still feel it.
And for clarity, you were on paid staff that 6 months in '68, and then you came back as paid staff in '71. How long did you stay on paid staff?
I think, okay, we got married in '74. I'm thinking to '74.
Okay.
Because I think that's when things really changed for me. Because when Steve and I got married, I wanted to have kids because my first husband did not. And in fact, I had an abortion when I did get pregnant for Robert because he did not want to have children. And so that's when I felt the responsibility that I needed to go to work. I mean, you know, that I needed to have a real job because we needed to get a house. And there were all these things, so sort of everything shifted. And I did. I got pregnant, I guess, 2 weeks after my marriage. And, you know, because Steve's mother counted up the months to make sure it was 9 months after we were married. And I did not know at that time that Steve came from the Washingtons and the Cheshires and the, you know, that he came from all these illustrious blue blood families on his mother's side and father's side. My son was supposed to be born on February 14th, Valentine's Day. That was the due date. He waited until February 22nd, which is George Washington's birthday. And I had no idea that he was related to George Washington. What happened is that we went up to Warm Springs where his mother and father lived, and he drove a big truck, and I was actually pregnant with Wilson, and they flew me up because they didn't want me, you know, to have any issues with my pregnancy. And when we were in the house, Steve's mother came up with a portrait of George Washington and says, "I want everybody in the family to have one of these. I have several of these." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Marjorie, because we're directly related." And she had this kind of English accent because she grew up in the British part of Shanghai as a child until she was 6. So she had this kind of British accent. And I'm going, "What?" And then Big Steve, Steve's father comes out with this big family tree, and just I'm going, what? You know, because Mariah Washington, Steve's great grandmother, was the last Washington to live at Mount Vernon. So when they go, they're considered family, and they have the run of the whole place because that's their home. Okay, that's just the beginning. Steve's mother took us to Williamsburg one time when I was up there. We were all up there, and she showed us Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, the first governor of the state of Virginia. She's a direct descendant, and there was a Tucker living in the Tucker house there. And then she would tell me all these stories about their relations. And I thought, said, Steve, why didn't you tell me that? He said, they were all slave owners. He had never told me. So, you know, it's interesting. I just did not know that. But of course, my kids grew up in a very different, you know, because they're family, and they very much are aware of who their ancestors were on Steve's side of the family. Mm-hmm. And they've been much more involved with it. So I can't remember what question that was. Oh, I was just thinking about Wilson, yeah, being born.
And that you had worked as a paid staff member
right.
on the Bird,
right,
up until getting married.
Yeah,
and
74, and then I started working full time. First as a legal secretary, and then when I finished my undergraduate degree, then I got a paralegal certificate, and I worked the last 25 years or whatever as a paralegal.
Okay, which I want to get to, mm-hmm. But a few more points on the Bird. What do you recall of, like, clearly discussing what community there was amongst the Bird, even despite disagreements? What do you recall of reactions from the general public, the outside world, beyond the community of those working on the Bird? How do you think that they perceived the paper?
I think it was different for different people. We could see from the Bird being firebombed, also the difficulty of getting the Bird printed at times, and how people had to go around to various printers to get them to actually do it. And I know towards the end of the Bird, they were having to travel a long way to get, I think it was Birmingham, Alabama or somewhere, to get it printed. And also, we did a lot of muckraking. Now, I wasn't involved in that, but Candy Hamilton definitely was, about local politics. So a lot of research and a lot of really biting commentary. So I'm sure there were people that were reading this newspaper that agreed with that, but this was a very conservative town, so I'm sure most people, because I saw the Bird with Steve in Underground Atlanta a lot of nights, and we just did not get a lot of pushback. We didn't get a lot of insults. Now, of course, everybody had been out drinking, and maybe we're in a more jovial mood, but I don't remember ever being. The only time I remember being intimidated myself. But I'm not a good person to ask about this because I'm really an introvert. So the only people I really hung around were Bird people. But we went to this demonstration on Peachtree, and I can't remember what it was about, but I remember I was taking pictures, and a policeman grabbed my camera strap and was trying to pull it up my neck, only it was plastic so it wouldn't break. And that's the only time I really felt real fear, like this man's going to kill me, until I took it off, and then he took the film out and threw it on the ground and gave me back my camera. So I knew that there were people that did not like even the most benign, like this was some demonstration about it. Either it was anti-war, or it was pro-gay, or it's pro-student. Because I went to another demonstration, we went to cover a school strike. It was somewhere up north in Atlanta, I don't remember exactly where. And those of us from the Bird that were taking pictures and reporting, we were arrested. I mean, I was never taken down to the jail. I was just put in a separate space with a bunch of Bird people that were like covering and obviously applauding this it had to do with, I think, the length of people's hair. I can't remember what it was. But it was something very benign. But the police were very angry and clearly separating us from the students. So those are the only things that I remember personally. But I know we were doing a lot of activity around Georgia Power and Georgia Power rate hikes, around atomic energy, nuclear energy, and the pollution of the Savannah River and other things. So I think that there were people, because like when we sold the bird, we sold to a lot of people that were obviously professionals, young professionals and stuff like that, as well as students. But like when I was down in underground Atlanta, and Steve sold at Lenox a lot, because he earned his living, selling the bird. That just shows you how humble our living was. Because I think we sold them for a quarter, and we got 15 cents or something. But I just don't remember people being hostile to us. I remember people, oh, the bird, like it was a weird thing. They were interested. Oh, I want to read a copy of that kind of thing. They'd heard about it. And also, I think they just wanted to support us. But I don't know that they agreed with everything in the paper. But that's sort of my range. And I was in a number of demonstrations that were held in Atlanta. But again, I was marching with the folks that we all agreed with one another. And I just wasn't cognizant. But nobody ever threw eggs at us or rotten food or anything when we were on these demonstrations. I don't remember any counter demonstrations. So I didn't feel intimidated. I knew that we had a perspective that was different from a lot of people. But I don't remember feeling any hostility myself. But I knew from like the laws that were here, like you couldn't drink on Sunday and a lot of things that were very different, like in California, obviously. But I just didn't feel the hostility.
Yeah. And for you, what was the purpose of the paper? What did you hope that it would achieve?
Well, I had, grown up in the third world. I knew that the majority of human beings on Earth suffer greatly. They don't have indoor plumbing. They have a home they've put together from things they found. They don't get enough to eat. They have to do these really difficult jobs. They have no opportunity. So I came from a sense that what's right is to share the wealth of this world and of the people that have enormous wealth, And also I was opposed to the war in Vietnam, just like all the wars that have happened since then, like war in Iraq. Look what it's done to the Middle East. And now Syria. So I came from a perspective of wanting all human beings to be empowered and to be able to get a decent job and live in a decent home and have opportunity. And I knew that they couldn't. So I see the bird as the voice of these progressive ideas. I knew that we had to take care of the earth. That holistic foods, organic foods are so much better because they don't contain these pesticides and chemicals. Not mistreating, not having factory farming, but having smaller farms where animals can eat grass and live outside in the sunshine and oxygen. I knew all these things were the right things to do, and so I saw the bird as the voice of that, and I saw the lawyers around it that were protecting us from different lawsuits that were being brought. I saw them as very progressive, so I felt like I was in the bosom of all of these progressive people, and to me that's heaven. Just like now with climate change, it's being in the bosom of these progressive people all around the world that see, this is the only planet we have. We have to get a different perspective on this. You can't have unlimited growth. You can't have unlimited human population. It's not possible on this finite world. So that's, and with the bird, I was with all these people that felt the same way. And it was just very comforting for me. Of course, I wasn't putting myself out there the same way that other people, that were writing the more muckraking stories or were out demonstrating about Savannah River plant, nuclear plant, and stuff like that. But I don't know of any demonstrations that were broken up by police other than the two I was talking about before.
Yeah, I'm missing on the year. The riot in Piedmont Park, were you here for that one? The police riot?
No, I think that happened between 68 and
Yeah.
71.
Yeah.
And I think that's when people, because people before that were taking off their clothes and swimming in the lake and. And I understand that Steve was one of the main show-offs, so, I wasn't there during that period.
Mm-hmm. What about the firebombing though in '72? We were here for that.
I was here, yeah. It was a real shock. Now, of course, I just walked up to it like I was going to work. So I didn't see it in flames. I just saw it as a burnt out building.
Were you aware that that had happened and that you were going,
Well,
like, had you been called before and said?
No, I walked there because I used to get there fairly early in the morning because I was an early morning person. And I think that bird people just started gathering, and and talking about it, and I don't know if they had already called the police or if the police had called somebody. I just remember standing around with everybody just going, oh my God, because it was just, wet, and it was totally burned down. So it was, it's a shock, it was very sad. I did not see the actual fire bombing, and I did not see it on fire, and I can't remember if anybody from the bird did. But it was clearly, an act of anger against us and
Right.
trying to put us out of business.
And how did you feel at that point?
I felt terribly sad, but I did not feel scared, and I think that's because we had a community, and I knew we had a community with attorneys and that were very good and brave about filing lawsuits, and I knew we had wealthy donors, that would help us. I felt protected in a sense just by the community that was around the bird. And everybody came together, and I believe we put out a newspaper the next week. I
You
don't
guys
know.
didn't miss.
Yeah, so everybody was just like, this is not going to affect, we are going to find a way, and I can't remember where we moved to at that point. I think it was North Avenue, but I'm not positive.
Mm-hmm.
But there was just total determination. Nobody felt like they were going to win from that, like they were going to put us out of business or anything like that.
And we've talked a bit about how gender and even sexuality had a presence and affected the paper.
Right.
How do you think race also affected or was dealt with at the paper?
Well, I think, it was a white paper. And I think there were people who had ties to the black community in various ways, either through their work or through people they knew that were putting out black newspapers or were in the black gay rights movement. But there really were not a lot of black people around the Great Smoke Bird. And I know that a lot of the old folks feel like that was a real detriment to the bird, because Atlanta was a majority black city, and we just didn't integrate the bird with the black community. So I think, I know I was just mainly unconscious of it, unaware of it. Now I think there was some, because we did a lot of work with anti-war, there were a lot of GIs and people that were progressive that may have written to the bird or come by the bird, some of whom were black. Same thing with the gay rights movement. But there just weren't a lot of black people around the bird. So we just really did not, we had a lot of articles against racism. And we had a lot of articles that talked about the black student movement and other things. But the actual presence of black people, it just didn't happen very much at the bird.
Mm-hmm.
I think that all of our sentiments, it's the same thing with the Vietnamese people, and I think that's part of an element of the war. It's just that we feel like we're superior to brown people, and we can go and bomb their country and, destroy human beings just for no reason, you know. So I think that the war had an element of racism and all that we've done in Latin America, like the invasion of Grenada. I mean, you know, it comes from a sense that these people are beneath us and we have absolute power over them. And that's racism.
On the point of some of the Bird's coverage of race and imperialism and international politics, and you mentioning earlier Steve and Bob Malone going to Mexico. Did you ever get to travel any during those years or after the fact, particularly back to Central and South America?
You know, I never have been able to just because I've just not had the money. Now my daughter went to, after she finished her 10-year professional ballerina career, she went to Georgia State for her undergraduate, and her minor was Spanish, and she was involved in a group that went to the University of Guadalajara for one summer. And she wanted to travel in Mexico after that. And so Steve and I did not want her to travel by herself, so I went down and was with her. And it was really interesting because the first few days I was kind of accommodating myself to talking Spanish. But Maggie was really impressed that I could immediately, you know, talk in Spanish, although my vocabulary is very limited. But after a few days, I was thinking in Spanish and dreaming in Spanish. And the other thing Maggie says, my daughter says, is I'm a completely different person when I'm speaking Spanish. It's like my personality changes and I go into Spanish mode. So I know I could do that, I just haven't done it. And also I don't like to travel by myself, and at this point, you know, I've been single for a long time, and I mean, there are things I can do, and I've even talked to my friends about it, like you can find travel buddies, or you can go in a group. I mean, you know, the things I could do. So now that I'm retired, and over all the things that have happened to me since I'm retired, including this knee, I'm thinking more of that. Where do I want to go? I definitely want to go to Machu Picchu. Yeah. So where do I want to travel, and you know, how am I going to get that done, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the last trip I took was to China when I was pregnant with Wilson, because I was involved in this group called U.S.-China People's Friendship Association.
Wasn't Ann Jenkins really involved?
Yeah, she was really involved. In fact, she went on the same trip I went on. So, you know, I think I told you that Steve's mother grew up in China. There were a lot of Americans. Her mother worked for the YWCA in China, and her father, and that's how they met, was a teaching doctor, medical doctor, and there was an Episcopal teaching hospital in Shanghai, and that's where he worked. So I had been interested in China. I also read The Long March. I was just fascinated by what was happening with China and the revolution. And there were a number of old China hands in Atlanta, just like there are all over the country. People that had worked in China before the revolution and had left. And they were kind of also the steadfast members of this organization, and I really liked them. So we had had this organization since Nixon, it was before Nixon went and established diplomatic relations. But after Nixon established diplomatic relations, the Chinese invited a lot of groups from the China Friendship Association on trips. And this was the first one from the Southeast. And I was actually chosen as the leader of this group. And so I went but I was pregnant with Wilson. Of course, I didn't tell the Chinese. But when I got there and they found out, they were very upset. And there were certain things they wouldn't let me do. And they had me go to the doctor several times. Yeah. And they kept trying to bring, I was not eating well because all this food was so different. And we'd have these huge banquets, with this whiskey that they drank. Anyway, I would almost be like throwing up, because one of the things that was always on the table was these 100-year eggs, that, you know, these black eggs that are actually buried in ash, and all of these things that they thought of as delicacies, like chicken eyes and fish eyes, and I mean just, and I was the host, so I was supposed to be, you know, eating all this stuff, but I just mainly wanted the sweet. And they would bring me up these bowls of soup every night and say, please drink this, you know, you need to keep your health up, etc. So it sparked a lot of difficulty for the translators and stuff, because we were there in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. We did not know until years after we got back that that's why our translators were so nervous. They're trying so hard to be, you know, proper Communist Party members so they wouldn't get beaten up and stuff. But that was the last trip I took. I was pregnant with Wilson.
And tell me a bit more of how you got involved with this organization and how you were chosen to be a leader of the delegation.
I think it's just because I was really actively involved. I guess because I had lived, you know, around the world too, and I didn't think it was good for us to hate and fear the most populous nation in the world. And of course, China was very different at that stage than they are now. But I was very active. We had a bunch of fundraisers, and there was a restaurant in Emory Village that would let us use their facility for money making, you know, for fundraising. And I think we had several dinners, and I would actually grow bean sprouts in my bathtub in order to have lots to take, you know, and we made egg rolls. There's a bunch of us that were willing to make the food. And, you know, people would come in and, you know, we'd advertise and stuff. So I was very kind of active in the fundraising and just the meetings and everything. And so I think people just thought I should, you know, be the head of the tour. So I was. But often, I mean, like the Chinese would not let me go on the Great Wall. They were concerned about my health. They would not let me go on the Ming Tun because it was underground. So there were things that they limited because I was pregnant.
And how long was the trip?
It was like, I believe it was 10 days in China, but at the time we had to fly across Canada because Canada had maintained relations, but we didn't have any. So we would fly up to Canada, across Canada, then to Japan, then to Hong Kong, then to Guangzhou by train. So I think it took 3 days to get there, and 3 days to get back. So it was a long trip.
And did you travel around the country?
We did. We started out, I can't think of the name of the town. We started out at this larger town that was having a craft fair. So that was really fascinating. They had these huge buildings full of Chinese crafts, which go back for centuries. So all these wonderful embroideries and ceramics and carvings. So it was all of that kind of stuff. And then we flew from there to Beijing. Then we took a train up further north to Tangshan, which was one of the cities that was so badly devastated by the earthquake that happened the year after. Remember, when hundreds of thousands? So we went up into the mountains there. We went to a commune called Shashiyu, which was on top of, around the sides of this mountain that was granite. And they showed us a film where they had dug out all of this granite to make a big cistern to save water. And they did it all with pickaxes. Then they took all that stone that they had gotten out of the, to create the cistern, and had built homes of stone. And they had planted the mountain with tall pines at the top, and then as it got closer to the bottom, fruit trees to stop the rain when it came down to, disperse it so it wouldn't come down and take all the crops out. Then they built all of these terraced fields for the rice and the vegetables. And they had, of course, this was during the Cultural Revolution. We didn't understand this, but they had brought people, engineers from the city, to live in this commune that helped them with all of this design. And also they had, they stored the pig manure in such a way that it made energy for the homes and the school. And they prepared this incredible meal with all these vegetables and grains that we don't normally eat. But it was really an amazing experience. Then we went to Tangshan, where we were hosted by coal miners that had worked in that area. Then we went south towards Shanghai, and we went to a couple of towns, I can't think of their names, but they were known for their beauty and the waterways, the canals and stuff. And then we went to Shanghai, where we were greeted by the most doctrinaire communists, and I think that Shanghai was one of the hotbeds of the Cultural Revolution. We could see, like, our translators were almost quaking, because they were afraid of being pointed out as petty bourgeois or whatever. But it was fascinating, and China was not set up for tourists at that time at all. So we stayed in what were known as hotels, but had no heat, because the Chinese they didn't have any heat. They wore these really padded clothing that was padded with down feathers. But the buildings were all really cold. And they said that was good for your health, which I understand that it is. But anyway, it was not. In Beijing and in Shanghai, we stayed in an actual Western hotel. But for most of the travel, we stayed in very humble. But they were beautiful. They were clean, and they're perfectly fine. Except it wasn't like a tourist kind of thing. Yeah. So it's fascinating.
Were there any? You said that you think that Ann Jenkins was on the trip with you.
Yeah.
Was there anybody else from the Bird or around the Bird?
Yeah, like Gingham Graves, who now goes with Jean Guerrero. She was on that trip. Tom and Claire Davis, both of whom live in Atlanta. They weren't around the Bird. They came later for the the kind of Marxist movement. So there were, I can't remember how many people. It wasn't that, maybe 20 people or something. But there were a lot of people from the southeast. There were a number of medical workers, and one of the things we did, it was either Beijing or Shanghai, so we went to a traditional hospital, and we watched an appendix surgery with acupuncture rather than anesthesia like we would do. And we walked down the halls where they had all of these framed pictures of various herbs and what the herbs did. And I think we each got an acupuncture session. But it taught, and we had a lecture about traditional medicine and how long it had been there. And we saw a lot of traditional pharmacies as you walk up and down the streets. And also we went to school for the deaf, where they were using acupuncture to regenerate the nerve, the hearing nerves in the ear, and they put acupuncture needles here in the hands and in the feet, because the hands, the feet, and the ears replicate the body. And they put different acupuncture points for different aspects of your body, like your hands, your ears, and your feet each have where the liver is, where the spleen is, where the colon is, where your eyes are. And interestingly, they also talked about how originally acupuncture happened, because the Chinese, like the Romans were, and other were documenters of history. They always documented things then. And they found, and this happened thousands of years ago, because the Chinese civilization has been there for 15,000 years or longer, and they started writing in 5,000 years. But they found that when people came out of, they used very slender bamboo arrows. And they found that when people came out of battle, some were not in pain. But as they took the arrows out, they started having pain. So it was documenting people that were wounded during war over a long period of time, where they discovered that there are these meridians of energy. Of course, we don't believe in energy, but all of the Asian and the Indian peoples all say that there's a system of energy that runs through our body, which keeps us alive. And I think now modern physics even understands that we live in a milieu of energy that is awareness. I mean, because one of the big studies in physics right now, advanced studies, is of consciousness. What is consciousness, and is at the base of everything? But anyway, the Japanese or the Chinese discovered that there's a system of energy, and they can tap into it, and therefore direct energy to heal different parts of your body, or to cut off pain from different parts of your body. So that was fascinating.
Yeah. Sounds like an amazing trip.
It was fantastic.
And in your years working with the bird, and then subsequently as well, you had mentioned, and we've discussed, the women's group that you were a part of. Were you involved with any other sort of movements outside of the bird, or was your activism largely through the bird into...
Well, it started out through the bird because, like I said, so we got married in
74.
74, yeah. Then my son was born in 75, then my daughter was born in 76. At that time, I was probably volunteering just a little bit at the bird because I was also working full-time. And Steve and I had bought a home in Grant Park. So we were living away from the bird.
In which part of Grant Park?
It was on Hill Street, close to the freeway. We were about a block and a half away from the freeway.
Mm-hmm. And was anybody else
No,
in your friend group living over there?
No, it was just us. And Steve didn't want to buy a house that cost more than $10,000. So we bought this house for $10,000. And when we moved in, we found out it had been a rooming house, a flop house, since the white folks there'd been white flight when African Americans had started moving. So that whole area had just been rented for a long time. And that the pipes under the house were all rusted out. So the pipes that brought gas into the house, the pipes that brought water into the house were all rusted out. And we moved into the house shortly after I came back from China. So I was quite pregnant with Wilson. And I was the only one because my husband is so laid back. He wasn't at all upset that we didn't have a bathroom that worked or heat that worked, but I was. And I was actually taking showers at my neighbor's house next to work because I had to go to work in an office every day. So anyway, we did scrounge up the money to get the pipes fixed and get the kitchen fixed up and to be able to move in. And then I was like a crazy person. Because there was all this paper, wallpaper that had been painted over and painted over. So my friends and I, after work every day, we'd come and scrape the paper off the walls and you replaster and do refinishing plaster and paint, and because my son was going to be born, and fix up curtains for his room and all this stuff, and then finally redo the floors, because it had brown paint on it. But I was like, I guess women have this nesting instinct when they're pregnant and they just want to get it fixed up. So I did that madly until Wilson was born.
To get all that done in a couple months?
Yeah, basically. So Wilson came, and then shortly after that I got pregnant with Maggie, and Maggie came. So I kind of pulled away from a lot of activity, but I was in the U.S.-China Friendship Association. And I think I was in a study group which we studied about women as well as other things, communist movement and other things. And there were people moving into this collective called the October League, which was basically a Marxist organization where they wanted everybody to go into factories and work with the working class and help build a revolution. So Steve and I got involved with that for a number of years. And but as I was raising my kids, because
But you didn't, did you go to work in factories?
I actually did. I worked in 2 factories. I worked at, what's it called? It's called something linen. And it was on a street that now is full of, including the building that I worked in, was a factory. There were lots of factories in, like what's now Candler Park, on Edgewood in North Highland. Steve worked in several factories there. So I can't remember, but the second word was linen. And we sewed hospital gowns, like for the hospitals, and we sewed aprons for chefs and stuff like that, because it also ran a huge laundry. So they would provide these, and then they would also pick them up and launder them. Mm-hmm. So a lot of those kind of garments. And I was pregnant with Maggie, so when there was no maternity leave, once I got to a certain size, they fired me because I couldn't actually get close enough to the sewing machine. And then after Maggie was born, I worked in Aero shirts for a couple of years. But then it just wasn't enough. I think I got $2.10 an hour. And it was also piecework, but it just wasn't enough to support a household and 2 kids, because where we lived, we were sending them to daycare every day, both of them. And so I went back to doing secretarial work. Mm-hmm. And working mainly for 2 different agencies that would keep me pretty busy. And then I finally got hired at King and Spalding, and I worked there for a while. Then after the divorce, so we were married for 10 years, almost exactly. And once I divorced Steve, I had to I had to get medical benefits and all of that stuff. So I started working more regularly at major law firms. And I wanted to finish my undergraduate degree because I'd done 3.5 years at Atlanta College of Art. Well, I'd done a lot of college, University of Florida, UCLA, and then I went to Atlanta College of Art. So I had spent a lot of time in school. But
in Vermont.
And I had to work 3 semesters at Vermont finally. But by the time I finished, I'd gone to undergrad school for like 6 years or something. But I did that.
What did you ultimately get your degree in?
It's called General Studies.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I went to paralegal training and got my paralegal certificate. But it was long, because I had
And where did you do that through?
That was in Buckhead at the time. It was the only ABA, Atlanta Bar Association, qualified school, paralegal school, which
Mm-hmm.
a lot of law firms wanted you to get ABA approved. So it was lucky I went there. But I went at night and on the weekends. Yeah.
And where did you move to after your divorce? Did you stay in the house, or?
Well, I stayed in the house for a little while, but the problem was because Steve worked for a certain, he was fired from basically every job he had until he started working as a courier. Just because he was getting these terrible jobs and he was much smarter, and it just didn't work out well. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. So when I was living there and I had the kids, we left early in the morning. They each went to separate schools because my son had what's called learning disabilities, but it's really not learning. I mean, it's just that he learned a different way. So he and Maggie went to different schools. So I would take them there, and then Wilson played soccer after school. Maggie went to dance. By the time we would come home, it was like 9 o'clock at night, and we were broken into 5 times. And the 5th time I just said, we can't stay here. It's just when you walk in the door and everything's torn up, and what little you have is gone. So I moved to a condo complex in Decatur because that was close to where they were both going to school. But then when they each hit the 8th grade, they were supposed to go to it's a high school in Decatur close to Emory. I'm trying to think of the name of the school. I can't, but anyway, it was a really good school. Mm-hmm. And Wilson had been at low water, which basically they individually tested everybody in his age group. They went from, I think, 1st grade to 7th grade. So Druid Hills High School, they were both. So Wilson started Druid Hills High School in the 8th grade. But basically what happened is that, so the kids of certain ages were put together, but they each were individually tested, had an individual curriculum. So when he went in the 4th grade, they each had a computer set up, and they each had their own coursework on a computer. And then they did a lot of, travel out to various events and stuff. And Wilson basically mastered the computer. I mean, from the time he was really young, I mean, he just understood it. And like when I finally got a computer in the house, we had to go through DOS and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson would do the 3x5 cards, so I could actually work on a computer. And now he's a computer expert. He's a principal applications architect at Turner, which is not called Turner anymore. But I mean, he's just brilliant, and he continues to study. But it was all because his work was on the computer when he went to this school.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. But Maggie was actually in Paideia, and she just didn't want to leave Paideia. So she had to get a scholarship, and she got a scholarship based on her dance. Besides, I mean, she had to keep a straight A average, and then she had to continue her dance, and she did. So she went to school every day, then she'd go immediately to dance. Either Steve would take her usually, and then I hired somebody where she would take Maggie to dance, and then Maggie would babysit her two little boys when she did it. So that also went on for a number of years. I kept working, as a paralegal at that point.
Mm-hmm. Hold on one second.
Sure.
I'm just going to switch out these recorders. Okay.
So what were you talking about?
Your life after the bird,
Right.
and all of your kids' activities, and just busy schedules. But I think the question that I had asked was,
Did I stay in the house after the wedding?
well, and what type, and also, were you involved in different types of activism and groups, movements outside of the bird, or did it largely funnel through the bird, and then once you had left the bird?
Well, so I went from the bird, and I was still at the bird when I was doing U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, and other people on the bird were also involved in this U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. Then, after I had my kids, the only organization I've been really involved with is Women's Caucus for the Art. And also during all this time, I was doing my art, and I went to Atlanta College of Art for 3.5 years, and I would submit my work to shows and stuff. So I was showing a little bit, and even after the divorce, the same thing. I would just work on my art at home. And then, I worked full time. I had these 2 kids, and I did my art. So that was basically what I was doing. And I joined the Women's Caucus for Art of Georgia, which I'm still a member of. So that was basically my work, my life. And my daughter was very involved in dance and became a professional dancer after high school, and went and danced for 10 years before she went to college. And my son was very involved with soccer and with his school. And then, Steve and I cooperated the whole time, because to us the most important thing was Wilson and Maggie. and making sure that they got to wherever they were going, and, we got the food and, basically took care of them.
Yeah.
So we've always co-parented, and they were very close to their dad, and he was a fabulous dad. Very different from what I grew up with. He was just the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He would get down on the floor and play with them from the time they were babies. That just total involvement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I lucked out in that respect.
And so you had moved to Decatur for their middle school and high school?
Yeah.
Have you stayed in Decatur?
Well, unfortunately, when they each turned 18, they wanted to live on their, Wilson moved out and Steve got him an apartment so that he could be with his girlfriend. So he moved out, and then Maggie moved in with Steve so she could be with her boyfriend, because I wouldn't let them, do that in my condo. And I got so lonely with both of them gone, I actually sold it, which I wish I had never sold it, because it was a 3-bedroom condo in a place that now is unaffordable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started renting in Virginia Highlands because I had friends there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in Virginia Highlands since they moved away.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then like in 2012, I bought another tiny condo for myself in Virginia Highlands, and that's where I live.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I have a home, a permanent home again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it was very, when my kids moved out, it was very traumatic for me, very hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And since I was the one who was strict and said you can't do this, and their dad was totally permissive, oh yeah, you can come over here and do that, I had a very hard time for a long time. Now they're married, and we have a very different relationship.
Yeah.
But that was very painful for me. Yeah.
I did want to ask, what you had mentioned when you were working, you and Steve were working in factories and trying to organize workers. How much success or reception, positive reception, did you have amongst your fellow workers?
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. Now, there were some people, like at Aero Factory, Sandy Stimson was also working there with me. And she's very outgoing. And she has stayed in working, with unions, and to this day. She went from Aero shirts to other factory jobs, and has worked for unions for a long time.
Mm.
So she really is an organizer. But I had absolutely no positive response, and people started to just really be suspicious of me, because, it's interesting. I would talk to people like at what was it called? Anyway, I can't remember the name of the first place. About organizing working people and wouldn't you want a better life and blah blah blah, and they'd say, my mom told me, or my dad told me, that communists, watch out for people that talk to me like that because they're communists. And I was just so shocked. But if I got to know them better, they'd realize that I was carrying out exactly what their parents said. Then I wanted to come to meetings, and I wanted to do this, and and that's exactly what. So, that's the kind of response I got from both the folks at the first job and the second job. I'm just not good enough. I'm not convincing enough. You have to be this kind of person that can get through that and get to a point where, there are only going to be a few people that are interested, but you have to get through a lot of people like that, and then people become suspicious of you, and they tell everybody else who you are and what you're trying to get them to do, and that you want them to buy this newspaper, and blah blah blah. So I am not an organizer. I'm not good at that, and I was completely ineffective. And I don't know about Steve. I just know that we were earning $2.10 an hour each of us, and it just wasn't enough to keep the family going. Mm-hmm. And besides that, Steve was an intellectual, and he was going to Georgia State, and then he went to Guatemala to do study, and then he wanted to do more. And his professors kept saying, "You don't have to do that, Steve. All you have to do is stay home and write your thesis, and then we want you as our doctoral student. We'll pay you. You'll be teaching class. You'll have a stipend. you'll be able to even take your family to Guatemala. Don't go to Guatemala now, write your thesis now. So after 10 years of that, I said, you know, I can't do this anymore. I can't carry all this anymore. Yeah. So, but I mean, you know, I have the greatest respect for him, for his work, for his mind, for all the research he's done. Yeah. Yeah, so I kind of checked out of the movement in the sense that I just had too much, because I had these 2 kids and I had a job that I had to keep up, and I was trying to finish my education, and then I was trying to be an artist, and it just, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know.
There aren't enough hours in the day.
Right. So I actually brought these 2 postcards for you all, because the women's organization I work in, we have an art and activism committee that's very active, and the only thing we're dealing with at this time is the climate crisis. And we're going to have this show and a panel discussion of people that are, you know, very well known in the anti-climate warming movement as speakers there. And so if you know anybody, or if you would be interested, this is happening next March.
Yeah.
So I brought this for you, because this organization has been very active in various, like we did an anti-child slavery show last year, you know, and brought other groups together. So we're really active politically, but this is the kind of activism that I'm involved in.
No, thank you. Yeah, I will certainly share this with my colleagues.
Right. And I don't know if you've heard of the new iteration that is being spoken of about the bird, an online newspaper in Atlanta that a group of old bird folks are talking about trying to get started.
No.
And they're looking for people that would be interested in being involved in this, or who know, like, young writers who would be interested in being involved in this. Because we, you know, these folks feel, and I feel the same way. We had a big discussion at the bird anniversary party last Friday night. Jesse Crawford is willing to support it and sustain it for a number of months to see if it can get off. But they're really looking for young people, young writers, young media enthusiasts who want to do online media. And Hamilton Nolan is coming into town, and Jesse is going to hire him as part of the organizing to see if this can be organized, to see if this can be set up as a sustaining thing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you haven't been involved in these discussions?
No, I haven't heard about it yet.
Gosh.
That's exciting.
I will definitely. Would you mind me putting your name as somebody that should be kept apprised of it?
Please do.
Okay,
yeah,
I will.
Absolutely.
And you think Catherine would be interested?
Let's check with her.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you don't mind my asking, who all has been involved?
So Jesse was the one who first brought it up. Have you met Jesse Crawford?
I haven't met Jesse yet.
I hadn't seen him for 35 years. The Coffins.
Okay.
And so then they contacted me. They contacted Steve. So I think Steve may be involved. So they're trying to set up like a committee to discuss this, and who would be an advisory committee, because all these folks are old. You know, an advisory committee of whoever young folks they can gather that would be interested. Becky Hamilton, of course, you know, Hamilton Nolan's mother, and I don't know who else, but I know that those
interesting.
folks. Yeah.
I look forward to hearing more about it and seeing how it takes shape.
Yeah. So it would be like an alternative to the media now that doesn't cover. I mean, there have been demonstrations about the Georgia power rate hike that haven't been covered. There have been climate actions that haven't been covered. So it was like a news outlet, online news outlet, that would cover news that's now not being covered by the local press.
Speaking of reiterations of the bird, or of the spirit of the bird, were you involved at all in the reincarnated bird in the mid-'80s?
I wasn't, and you know why? It's because it came to be shortly after our divorce.
Yeah, I was just looking at the years of 84, 85. That would be a...
Yeah,
Yeah.
So, but Steve was very involved. So that was his thing. And I basically was just taking care of the kids, and I just couldn't at that point. But I know he was very involved in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I knew it was happening, and I kept kind of apprised, but they just weren't able to make it sustainable.
Right. So reflecting back on the years working with the bird and the relationships that you made and sustained, how would you say that those years working around the bird affected your subsequent life?
I think it's probably one of the main events in my life. You know, all of my really good friends come from the bird that I'm still friends with, that, you know, we still get together every year. A lot of my views were formed at that time, or, you know, I grew a lot more in understanding about all the areas that we need to have progressive views about. It was so meaningful to me to have a community of like-minded people to be in, to feel sort of enfolded in, rather than, you know, as individuals out in this world, it's very hard to sustain all of that, or to feel a part of, to feel like I have these friends I know that I can go to and talk about the deepest things in my heart, because I know what they feel, because we were all in this together. So it was very important in my life, and I feel like I've never lost contact with that, and that's the most meaningful relationships. I mean, these folks I've known for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and they're my best friends. So it was very important.
Yeah. And you're speaking to that of that these relationships have been sustained all these years. Who are you closest with still?
I would say Nan and her second husband Charlie, even though Charlie wasn't really involved in the bird. Mm-hmm. He's been a progressive and worked in the labor movement, and then in elections he worked at Atlantic Steel. Phil and Teddy Vale. Mm-hmm. Teddy was very involved in the bird. Susie and Bob Goodman, they were very involved. Stephanie and Tom Coffin, Becky Hamilton, and her husband David Nolan, even though he wasn't so involved with the bird, he was involved in U.S.-China Friendship Association and also in the OL, October League. Steve, Henry Kahn, and Mickey mm-hmm. Gilmore. I mean, who else? Jean Guerrero, and his now girlfriend Gingham, because Gingham came on the Friendship mm-hmm. Association. So I would say they're my closest friends, and then my other closest friends are around my art life. You know, my longtime teacher Philip Carpenter, again very progressive, and his partner, who are gay. No, they weren't involved in the bird, but again, just all of my really close friends are very progressive, and it comes from, you know, my experience with the bird. To feel, you know, so I know a number of gay men couples that are my good friends. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, women in the Women's Caucus for the Arts, who again, often, very many of them are my Facebook friends, and they're all very progressive, and we as an organization are trying to do progressive things. But that whole understanding of how people can come together for a progressive cause, you know, that's what I've sought out in terms of my social life, mm-hmm. too. Yeah, like Nan and Teddy and I go to the Horizon Theater. We buy tickets together. We go to the Horizon Theater. Or I'll call up any of those friends of mine from the bird, and we'll go to a movie or something, you know. And we did the 50th reunion together. Yeah. I mean, not everybody always agrees with one another, but when you come down to it, you've been friends with them for 50 years, so you get over it real fast. us. Yeah.
Right. And so coming in towards the end, what are some of the ideas and ideals right now that matter the most to you?
Oh, I think the climate crisis is number one, absolutely. Because saving the planet is number one. And I've always had this sense, because well, I grew up in Latin America, but a lot of like Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, especially Guatemala and Honduras, they have huge population of Maya people. And the Maya people, the indigenous people, love the earth because everything that they do comes from the earth. And so they have a worshipful understanding of how important Mother Earth is and how important it is to be humble and to want to preserve. So I got that a lot. And in Guatemala, I learned how to ride horses, and we went from these stables and we would travel. We would just take the horses out on these long excursions. And what's amazing is in all these woods and stuff, you would come across pieces of Maya architecture. I mean, and same thing in Honduras. You can just be walking around and all of a sudden you see like a temple or a part of one. I mean, it was a huge civilization. And it's everywhere, the reminders of it. And when I went to visit my daughter in Mexico, and we'd get out to like about an hour and a half from Mexico City, and all of the people that were selling in the markets were speaking Nahuatl. They were speaking the Aztec language. They weren't speaking Spanish. So even all of these hundreds of years that Europeans have come to this continent, they haven't been able to wipe out the indigenous people. And it's they're so strong. And same thing with the Inca in Peru. You get up to a certain level of mountains, and it's mainly Inca, and they're using the same wool. They diet the same way. They're planting their same crops. Which potatoes and corn and Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, corn and beans and squash. The same thing that indigenous people had been growing. It just shows how important it is, and they preserve the earth, and we have had this view of exploitation. So I think the indigenous people are very important for our new world view, which we have to have. And then I think that the whole climate crisis issue takes everything into consideration. We're now learning that there are certain ways of farming, which is not industrial farming, which actually sequesters more carbon in the soil and will help cool the earth, but also that it's a sustainable way, where you rotate the crops, so you're putting in minerals and other things into the earth that renew it, instead of, right now we're just, with factory farming, we're just taking out nutrients and we're putting in poisons. And the fact that the insects that eat corn, for example, if you rotate crops, each crop has a different insect that likes to eat it. So if you rotate crops, you get rid of those insects. And if you rotate and you leave fallow land, then and you let the ducks and the birds go, they'll eat the insects from that piece of land. There's all these renewable things we need to be doing, and that's so everything's involved in renewing this land and fighting climate change. So it doesn't matter how you want to go, or the fact that you have to empower women to help with ending climate change. Because women are the main farmers in most of the world. So when you empower them, they can do more. So I just think that everything is part of this critical issue of stopping, the climate crisis. Yeah. So that's my, main concern right now. And I think it should be everybody's main concern. And we have so much work to do here.
And so little time.
Yeah, but we're going to do it. I believe we're going to do it. Because when most people begin to really understand what's happening and realize, and they're going to want to save the earth, except for the few that are so invested in the fossil fuel industry or so invested in the chemical industry or things that
are useless, you know, except for making profits for these people. You know, creating these terrible chemical fertilizers and pesticides and drugs. They don't help anybody but the few people that are making massive profits. And the vast majority of human beings aren't part of that.
Mm.
So I think we will do it. There may be a lot of harm done to the earth before that, and to people. Because we know, for example, the Bahamas, the height of most of those islands is like 10 feet from sea level. So there's a lot of islands that are going to be inundated. There's a lot of Florida that's going to be inundated because already, you know, the ice sheets are melting and there's going to be sea level rise. So I think people will begin to be alarmed, and also just the terrible flooding that's happened in this country and around the world. But, you know, a lot of Americans, you know that they don't usually have 100-year floods every year. And, you know, all the things that the scientists have predicted are beginning to happen. There's more storms, they're more dangerous, they do more harm. And I know that, like in Miami, if there's a high tide, Miami gets flooded in certain areas. So the more people wake up, and the more people see that renewable energies, you don't have oil spills, you don't have dead zones, because solar and wind and geothermal, they don't do damage. They're part of what we have already for free. And they begin to see that it's all for the profit of a few. You know, I think people will wake up. I believe it. But anyway, I hope that's true.
I hope so.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, unluckily, I will be dead by then, and it's my granddaughter who's going to have to suffer the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have gotten through
Yay! Hip hip hooray!
everything that I had noted down. Are there any other experiences or memories, topics that you'd like to cover?
No, I think I covered a whole lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the, you know, opportunity to empty my soul.
No, I am so grateful to you and all of your old friends for making
Yeah.
the time
Yeah.
and honoring us to come and share these.
Oh, we are so
This
happy.
history.
We are so happy that you all have a whole copy, you know, you scanned a whole copy of all of the bird issues, and that you've printed all the covers, you know, you've uploaded all the covers so that we can have access. You know, we're just so grateful to Georgia State for doing all of that. And this too.
It's a great legacy.
It is. It is.
Well, thank you again. If in coming days you think of other things, just let us know. We can continue on.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you're interested. I actually forwarded to Catherine this morning an invitation to one of the shows that I have a photograph in right now. And I also put down my art website, so if you want to see my paintings and my photographs.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'd
it's-
really be
it's
interested.
there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll turn this off for now.